Welcome back to the Direct-to-Video Connoisseur podcast. As always, this is Matt here, and I am joined by a very special guest this week. I've got Scott Murphy of the New Horror Express podcast and the All 90s Action All the Time podcast. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's very good to be here.
Yeah, for people that aren't familiar with your shows, I know I was on the All 90s Action All the Time one. I think we'll chat about that. I think it'll come out just before this episode is released. But yeah, for people that aren't familiar, what are your two podcasts about?
Oh yes. Well, since you mentioned your appearance on All 90s Action All the Time, I'll start with that one. Yes. Your episode of that will come out probably just a few days before this. We were covering Batman Returns, and you might be on a future episode as well, very close to that. Yeah, so All 90s Action All the Time. It's gone through a couple of changes. Basically, me and my regular co-host, Craig Jaheim, who also has his own podcast, the Bloodhound Picks, we just look at 90s action films, and we usually have a guest on, and we just break down the plot of each film. The kind of original format was that we were doing seasons, and looked at all the films of a particular actor in the 90s. So we did like 4 or 5 seasons of that. We did Steven Seagal, Sylvester Stallone, Val Kilmer, Kurt Russell. Was that it? Yeah. I think that was the 4 seasons we did. And then we started going more kind of just film by film. It was a bit of a random year this year. We thought we were going to close it down, but then we came back and we're just kind of doing. And then next year, going into 2023, we will be looking at any film celebrating a 30th anniversary. So films coming out that came out in 1993. Now, so we're going to be monthly now. So yeah, kind of in terms of release schedule and in terms of how we clump it together, bit of a change, but that's what All 90s Action All the Time is all about. And New Horror Express is an interview show. It's a fortnightly show where I chat to indie horror directors, actors, writers, novelists, just anybody who's working in horror today, mainly of the kind of independent variety. But yeah, I've talked to a whole bunch of people. That's been going well at the start of next year, 2023. It'll have been going for 5 years. I think I've put out I don't know, over 170 episodes. So yeah, it's still going strong.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. It's interesting because you're talking about like sort of the release schedules for them, and it is hard to like you said New Horror Express is fortnightly, and so now you've always got to kind of line up that guest right for every 2 weeks, and then it's saying like, okay, now I got to line up my guest for another one. I think it's one of those things where I don't know how to explain it. Like, I know for me with my podcast, that this is like the first year. This year is going to be the first year that I've been able to get a podcast out every fortnight, like successfully. Like that there wasn't a period here or there that I was supposed to do one that I didn't get one out. And so I definitely tip my hat to you that you have 2 podcasts, and the fact that you're even dialing it back to once a month for the All 90s one. I still think it's still quite a feat to be able to get them out that much.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I just I try my best. Yeah, sometimes with the New Horror Express, sometimes I don't quite manage it. With I don't think I've released every fortnight in the last 5 years. Actually, it's kind of that release schedule's kind of gone up and down as well, because originally it started as a monthly podcast, and then during the pandemic, I went a bit mad. So like, that's when we had like the seasons of the action podcast and New Horror Express during that time. In kind of there was a period in 2020, 2021 where New Horror Express was going out weekly. So like I just had podcasts, just recording podcasts all the time to stave off boredom and madness, I think.
Well, that was the thing I think with the pandemic is that all of us, our eyes got too big, right? Like, because we just looked at it, it's like, oh, we can really get content out there. I know a lot of people, people were like revisiting old podcasts that they did before, and you know all that kind of stuff. And the one podcast I have to hand it to is that the guys that come up as reviews, Ty and Brett, they always stuck with the same format, the first and 15th, and of course it helps in their case because they've got each other to be, you know, so like they never have to worry about if they don't get a guest, they can just do the show as just the two of them. But yeah, that was one of the things I think even for me, like when I got into the pandemic, I know I just started my blog again in like late 2019, and I went to a period where I was doing like maybe like 3 a week blog posts, and then what happened was the world kind of came back into I don't want to say it's back to normal necessarily, but it's like kind of a semblance of normal where all of the responsibilities that we all had suddenly crept back in. And then it was like, wow, I wasn't doing any blog posts. And I was like, I've got to kind of find a good, happy medium with all of this because, I think the pandemic gave us a false sense of like what was possible.
It definitely did. I definitely. That's why all 90s action all the time like shut down for a little while because like, and then I scaled back New Horror Express back to being fortnightly instead of weekly because I did kind of realize that once I was like back like working full time again and everything was opening up again and having a bit more of a social life, I was like, oh my god, I have zero time.
yeah, exactly. It's like one of those things where it's like suddenly like I mean, I know like in the early stages of the pandemic here, one of the things my wife and I was like, when I never left the apartment. I think the only time I ever left the apartment was that she had some medications that had to be picked up at the pharmacy. So those meant so like I would kind of strap up, like the mask and like the glove, like I had like kind of the whole the routine that I would go out for those. But otherwise, everything was, getting things shipped, all that stuff. Of course, there was no sporting events happening. So that was another piece too, right? Is that there was no sporting, no games to watch or anything like that. Movies had kind of also shut down. I always kind of forget about that too, that like there weren't as many movies being released at that time either. So it was like, yeah, there was like, we have time for stuff. And then suddenly everything just, or I shouldn't say suddenly, it was kind of more of a gradual thing. But then it was like, oh, now the movie theaters are opened up again. And it was like this sense of like, well, I've got to go to the movie theater because I didn't go. I couldn't go for this period.
Exactly.
Sporting with, like you said, going out with friends and all that stuff. All that stuff that we took for granted that we suddenly lost. And that was like, we felt like we had to make up for lost time. And I think, the podcasts that we were doing were the one casualty of that, I guess, to some extent, not a complete, not like we shut them down completely, but it was like we sort of slowed the process down a bit.
For sure. And I think there definitely was that time where you felt like there's kind of no new movies coming out. And I think like that's actually a big part of how the 90s Action podcast came about, because I realized that, early on when things closed down, it was like obviously such a depressing period. And then there was no new movies really. So I was revisiting old movies and I realized that what I wanted was nothing challenging. I just wanted comfort food movies. So I was revisiting all these kind of 90s action films and like 80s stroke 90s like slasher films. Like that's all I wanted to watch.
Right. And they are fantastic comfort food, right? Like when you watch those 90s actioners, I think like, even watching like Batman Returns for your pod, for my time when I was on the podcast with you, it was like a sense of like, I don't know how to explain it. Like I had seen that movie and I thought in my head I knew what that movie was, but then watching it again and being like, wow, no, this was how movies were made. This is how blockbusters were made in the early 90s. And it's not really like they're made now. Like you said, there's a comfort food aspect to it of like, man, I just kind of like to have that kind of that home cooking. And I think like you said, during the pandemic, we were all looking for things that could kind of give us that comfort.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean it's kind of one of those things. I think what's interesting now, I think, kind of almost like sort of segueing a little bit. Right now as we're doing this podcast, I think for the most part, teams have gone through the second match of the World Cup. So we're kind of we're still in the group stage of the World Cup as we're chatting about this, and it's interesting because I almost kind of see this playing out with fans of football throughout the world. That like there's this sort of disgust of the way it's been handled in Qatar, right? With like the civil rights abuses, the fact that players can't sort of speak their minds about the games, obviously the bags of money that were going on and all of that. But then also this sense of like, it's the World Cup. I want to see my players play. And I mean, obviously even the time of year has made it really, really odd. And so there's that almost like that sense of it, that this World Cup happening in 2022, it's almost like if FIFA was going to pull this whole Qatar thing, that this was the year to do it. This was the World Cup to do it in, because there are enough people that are like, I just want my World Cup, that are sort of ignoring all the other stuff.
Yeah, that's true. It is. It's really challenging. It's hard to just enjoy the football because obviously there's so many issues. There's issues with how Qatar got the World Cup in terms of like, bribery and corruption. But there's also just, there's the migrant labor rights. So many of the workers died making the stadiums and making the infrastructure around the World Cup, not necessarily just the stadiums, because they built like kind of basically whole new cities for this World Cup. It's crazy. And then, there's the women's rights issues, there's the LGBTQ plus issues, there's all these things going on. So the whole the whole controversy with the One Love armband, which, was a bit of a was a very small gesture in the first place. It was almost a nothing gesture in the first place, but still, at least it was something, and even that was quashed. So there is so much kind of pain and misery and oppression surrounding this World Cup. It is hard just to enjoy the football. I've been watching highlights and stuff like that, and have enjoyed some of the matches, but like at the same time, it is very difficult to just switch your brain off and just enjoy the World Cup.
Yeah, because the next one is going to be here in the States. Well, partially in the States, also neighboring countries of Canada and Mexico. And obviously, me growing up here in the United States' record on human rights is not the best either. But at the very least, in the U.S., couples that are straight couples that aren't married are still allowed to go out in public in the U.S. Yes, we just had a mass shooting at a gay bar, a gay nightclub here in the United States, and I don't think it's the hue and cry to sort of protect the LGBTQ plus community isn't as strong as it should be here. But at the very least, it's not illegal to be gay, going to those sporting events. And like you said, like, I mean, obviously the United States has a leg up in the sense that there's so many like 80,000 plus seat stadia here that they don't need to use slave labor to build new stadia for the event. But I think it's still that idea. I mean, even just the idea that like of the US's human rights abuses, if the German team wanted to wear Black Lives Matter shirts or the One Love, anything like that, the US wouldn't be putting pressure on FIFA to like yellow card them, or telling the stadia workers that they can't allow people in that have rainbow shirts or things like that. And I think that's probably where it's like it kind of steps over a different boundary from like, yeah, most countries have their issues with human rights abuses that are bad, and it's sort of like you don't want to point the finger when ignoring your own country's issues. But I think that's where the Qatar one takes it a step further. Is you can't go into the stadium if you're wearing these certain things, or just even like the fact that it's illegal to be to identify as LGBTQ plus. That probably like where it takes a sort of another step from what other countries in the world are, especially like sort of Western countries.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And it's one of those things that, you've got to be conscious of your own country's pitfalls. And, I come from Scotland. Obviously, Britain has a terrible record, historical record in terms of imperialism, and even in recent wars and conflicts that have happened in recent decades, there's been terrible things that you can point to and be like, well, you're not squeaky clean either. But again, that doesn't stop people from being able to criticize these regimes. And again, if the World Cup was hosted in the UK, the same thing. People wouldn't be pulled out of stadiums or stopped for coming into stadiums for having a rainbow flag. People, people would be, there would be no pressure again, like you said, from the English FA to the FIFA for people wearing players wearing armbands or anything like that. So and yeah, and obviously there's lots of stadiums in the UK, so that there'd be no slave labor again. So yeah, people should be conscious of their own history and their own problems with their own country, but I don't think that should stand in the way of calling out the human rights record of other countries, particularly a place like Qatar that seems so backwards in so many kind of regards through a kind of Western liberal perspective.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people that are, because like for me, I don't know necessarily that I boycott the. I haven't really been watching. I'm kind of doing the same thing as you are. Like I've been kind of just sort of catching highlights or seeing what people are saying about the games. And I have friends that are following it that are in text threads who are like talking about all the different games that are going on. So I've been still kind of following to that extent. I know I have a friend whose son is in this pool where if Argentina wins, they'll get season tickets to the Cincinnati Football Club in the MLS.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so I'm kind of rooting for that. I told him because we have a Hard Rock Cafe here in Philadelphia that their big menu item is the Lionel Messi burger. So I told him if they do win, if Argentina does win, that I will go to the Hard Rock Cafe and have one of those Messi burgers in his honor. If they make that win. So there are some of those kind of nicer things that are happening there, and I think that's part of it. I think that people, kind of that are world football fans are kind of looking for maybe they're sort of putting some of it aside, or not even putting it aside, just saying like, okay, I know this is really bad, but this is every 4 years, and what we've been going through in the pandemic over the past couple years, like I'm just happy to have football back. But I think even the time of year that it's happening in, like the world soccer schedule has always been created to fit the World Cup in the summer. Like it's just been designed that way, that it's always been like the United States, and I think Russia also does their league in the winter, or sorry, they do their league during the summer because it's so cold in the winter, and they've always had to take the break for the World Cup. But even that, you can kind of see that, like, for decades, the world football schedule has evolved to work in this way, that the club schedule happens during the winter, the World Cup happens in the summer, or the Euro tournament happens in the summer, or Copa America. And even seeing that disruption, that they've gone through this much trouble to fit Qatar in, that they've completely disrupted the club schedule, even that you can see how disruptive that is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I do feel very sorry for the players because there was a massive schedule pileup due to the pandemic, which means they're, between the kind of 2020, between the kind of 2019, 2020, 2020, 21 and the 21, this current kind of, the 21-22 season, those 3 seasons in a row were really compressed because of the disruption of the pandemic, and we had like the lockdown football and stuff like that. So there's already a massive schedule pileup. So there's already been a lot of tired players and a lot of injuries, and then having this compressing the schedule for the 2022-2023 season, we've had like kind of, I think, we've had like 4 seasons now that have just, I mean, like, there's a lot of tired players. There's got to be a lot of tired players.
Yeah, and like we talked about how the EPL, they have to get those Boxing Day fixtures in. So like while the other parts of the world are saying, yeah, we'll take a break, or we'll take our break, during Christmas like we usually do, the EPL is like, no, we got to get back. And that's an interesting thing too, because I think we've talked about how, in the decades that the EPL, or in the past like decade and a half or so, where the EPL has grown to be the premier football league in the world. And they've attracted a lot more players from outside of the UK, or outside of the British Isles region. It is interesting to see like how some of these traditions they haven't wavered on. Like they're going to make sure that they have those, like, every 3 or 4 days, around Christmas time fixtures.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I did, kind of talking about the World Cup. We've talked a lot about the kind of the darkness of this World Cup and the kind of messed upness of this World Cup in so many regards. But I did want to bring up just one fun thing because I did think of you when the US played Wales. Now Gareth Bale scored an equaliser against the Philadelphia Union in the MLS final, and then he scored an equaliser against the US in the first round of the World Cup. Do you now have like a picture of Gareth Bale on the dartboard?
Well, so the funny thing, right? My first introduction to Gareth Bale, of course, was when he played with Tottenham, and I've always been an Arsenal supporter. So it was one of those things where, like, when Real Madrid finally grabbed Gareth Bale, I thought, okay, this is going to be a nice relief. I didn't realize, of course, that Tottenham was going to take the money from Gareth Bale and just get a whole slew of great players on their team and actually be better than Arsenal for a lot of years. But yeah, so Gareth Bale's one of those ones where it was like once he moved on to Real Madrid, I was kind of like, oh, that's a relief. Like we don't have to worry about him anymore. But yeah, the goal against Philadelphia and the one against the U.S., it's like it's an interesting thing. I think it was funny when I would always watch the EPL when Gareth Bale was playing there. They would joke about how fans of England would complain, why can't we get great players like that? And of course, he played because he plays for Wales, so he's not, he doesn't qualify for England. Whereas, like, I think in a lot of other sports, the United Kingdom competes as the United Kingdom, but yeah, he's competing strictly for Wales, and so yeah, he's such a great player. That you have to, it's almost like I have to respect it. And it's, yeah, the dartboard thing, it's interesting because there are a lot of other players maybe that I might hate more where it's like him, it's like this grudging respect. Like I have to respect what he's doing on the pitch.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, it's interesting, and it's funny because they turned around and had trouble with Iran, which I have this theory about the Qatar World Cup that countries like Saudi Arabia, which of course Saudi Arabia, as we're talking today, I think they got demolished in their second game, but they surprised Argentina. But that some of these countries where there are a lot of restrictions on sort of the way people can live their lives, that going to Qatar, Qatar is actually a little bit looser in those restrictions than, like, say, Saudi Arabia or maybe even Iran. Whereas, for Western people going to those countries, it's like a kind of a shock to the system, that maybe those countries might have an advantage. But I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with the U.S. playing Iran. And by the time this podcast drops, I think that the entire World Cup is going to be done, and we're going to know who will have won by the time this one goes. But then
That's
you're going
true.
to have that intra United Kingdom battle between Wales and England, kind of almost. It's going to be interesting to see, like, how that one goes, because if England wins, right, they're through. But if Gareth Bale has a moment of brilliance against the UK, which he totally could if the game's close, it'd be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It'd be very interesting to see what happens. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. One funny anecdote too about the England-US game that happened yesterday here in the US, or it happened yesterday, in the World Cup. It was a 0-0 game, and it was funny. Like, you see the people from England, and my timeline who follow football are angry that that England couldn't score a goal and beat the United States. Like, what have we become that we can't beat the United States in a World Cup game? Whereas, like, the U.S. fans, a lot of them are not normal football fans, and they're looking at it like, I just spent 90 minutes watching a 0-0 draw. Like, what was that? Like, where are the goals and all of that? And so it's still funny how football hasn't quite caught on here in the United States to that degree, that when the
Yeah.
World Cup happens and you get fans that generally aren't used to it, they're just like, yeah, the beauty of a 0-0 draw is something that definitely is not. They still don't have the appreciation for that yet.
Well, yeah, I mean, football can be boring. Like some 0-0 draws are really fun, and
Yeah.
but a lot of Some are very, very dreary. And from what I saw on my Twitter feed, the US England one was on the drearier side of a 0-0 draw.
Yeah, exactly. It is funny, I think, in terms of how football, especially the EPL is growing here in the US. It seems like that, for myself, I was a fan of football when the World Cup came here in '94. So I've been sort of a convert for roughly almost 20 years now. But I've always been a fan of the four major sports here in America. So you've got American football, baseball, hockey, and basketball. Those are the four major sports. And I've always been a fan of those sports as well. And one of the interesting things that I've noticed is that as this sport has grown here in the United States, a lot of times they're taking people who aren't fans of the four major sports and turning them into sports fans. That people who normally wouldn't watch football, American football, or anything else, those are the ones that they're getting. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see. I think this World Cup normally the World Cup is what sort of gets people, sort of gets new converts. But because of where it's happening in the schedule, you've got three of the four major sports happening right now. You've got hockey, basketball, and then of course the NFL. Football is huge. So they're not getting as many converts as they normally would get with a World Cup because of the timing. And I don't know if that played into their sensibilities at all. I mean, obviously when the World Cup happens here, it'll change. But yeah, it's been interesting to see football or soccer's growth in that 18-year span since I've been a fan of it here in the U.S. And sort of seeing that timeline of so many people complaining about it being a 0-0 draw, when for the U.S. to get a 0-0 result against England is actually pretty good for the U.S. It still shows kind of how far it still has to go.
Yeah, absolutely. As a totally solid result. So yeah, it's yeah. I mean, I think the thing that surprised me most about the US team this time around was when we were playing Wales, and I had no idea that George Weah's son, Timothy Weah, played for the US. So that came as a complete shock to me. And I was like, oh, wow, okay, cool.
Yeah, and I think part of that, was because his family was like they're under the regime, I think, of Charles Taylor. I think his family was attacked in their mansion or something like that. I think he had to move out of Liberia. Otherwise, yeah, I think he probably would have, his son probably would have played for Liberia. But I think that was part of the issue there. But yeah, George, I mean, you think of him with those teams in AC Milan in those years in the '90s and how great he was.
Yeah, no, absolutely. He at that time, back in those days, and in the mid '90s, he was one of the top players in the world. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it is kind of funny because we're talking about that, like that was a time when Serie A was Serie A, maybe La Liga, but really Serie A was like the premier league in the world, and how just get some rich oil money, some Russian oligarch money into England, and suddenly the EPL is now the Premier League, where it's runs like maybe 6 or 7 teams deep that could have world class players that are on World Cup teams right now.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. It's all very much changed in the last kind of 20 years or so.
Yeah, it is, and I think in that sense, again, with this World Cup, like you said, sort of, and I don't know for you where you are, how the time zones line up. I think for us, they tend to be like afternoon times here in the U.S., but I don't know for you if it's sort of like they're a good time to be watching them, or if it's sort of like you've got to sort of check the highlights when you wake up or something.
Oh no, I just checked the highlights. New Zealand, the timings are horrible. So it's currently 4 games a day, and those 4 games are at 2 a.m., 5 a.m., 8 a.m., and 11 p.m.
So that
timing sense. So that's why I've just been watching the highlights.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like that was the same thing when the World Cup was in Korea and Japan in '02, I think. That was a similar situation for us, where it was like every game was in the middle of the night.
Yeah. It's pretty tough. So I don't know if I'll actually be watching any of the games. I think I'll just be watching the highlights.
That makes sense. Perfect. Well, yeah. Well, that was probably a good time. Maybe we'll segue into the film that we were discussing, which is Command Performance, Dolph Lundgren flick from 2009, one that he's directed. And Yeah, before we get into the film, Scott, what are your thoughts on kind of Dolph Lundgren overall?
Dolph Lundgren overall. So I guess that Dolph was not somebody I was super into as a kid. Like there were certain action star. I mean, the all 90s action all the time is part of a podcast network called the Last of the Action Heroes podcast network. And they cover a whole bunch of action stars: Sly, Arnie, Van Damme, Dolph, Mel Gibson. I think that's it. Yeah, I think, and they've got a Bond podcast as well. So Bond, I was big into Bond as a kid, and then I think like my kind of I followed most action stars, in terms of like Sly and Bruce Willis and Mel Gibson and all those. I think like my kind of top three would have been like Arnie, Jackie Chan, and Bruce Lee, who I know only has like 5 films, but like I watched them quite a lot. So like they kind of be my. And Dolph like kind of flew under the radar for me. I didn't watch a lot of Dolph films growing up. Obviously, because I was very much into Van Damme and I watched quite a lot of Stallone films. Saw him in Rocky 4, saw him in Universal Soldier. I think the really only two Dolph like solo vehicles that I saw him in was The Punisher, which I wasn't a big fan of. It's a lot of comic book films in the 90s aren't very good. And Masters of the Universe, which I did really like as a kid, even though I don't think it's a very good movie, but like I did really like as a kid. But I think like it wasn't really Dolph's performance that grabbed me. It was more like Frank Langella as Skeletor. I was really fun, and I just thought it was a kind of fun, colorful type of movie. So I don't know. It's interesting to me. I think I'm kind of slowly kind of coming around on Dolph. I didn't actively avoid Dolph. To be fair, it's not like there's certain action stars that I'm really not a big fan of, like Chuck Norris and things like that. And anybody who's like a kind of who does like kind of full serious, full kind of gritty action movies, very popular. The kind of, even though I like Liam Neeson as an actor, I don't particularly like him as an action star kind of thing. So I didn't avoid Dolph like that, and I did enjoy him in some things, but I think because he had that kind of, he just always seemed kind of rough and gritty to me, and it didn't seem to be much kind of charm or fun there, that like I wasn't attracted to him as a screen personality. However, this year, listening to the I Must Break This podcast, the kind of Dolph Lundgren podcast that's on the Last Night in Euro Network, I decided I'll go back and I'll check some of his films out. And I did think watching Showdown in Little Tokyo and watching Dark Angel, aka I Come in Peace, I was like, oh, maybe I'd be more into Dolph if I had saw those two films as a kid, because they're fun and kind of the type of action movie I kind of tend to respond to. I know that's a very long answer to your question.
No, because you bring up a fantastic point about Showdown in Little Tokyo, because that was the one that I mean, I knew of Dolph from Rocky 4. I knew of him as, Masters of the Universe. So I kind of knew who he was. But the funny thing is, in the early 90s, when Showdown in Little Tokyo came out, we have, in the United States, we have our cable systems. And at that time, it was easy to buy this box called a Discrambler that would give you all of the pay channels, like HBO and all of those things. And I had a friend who had that. And included in that was the pay-per-view. So I don't know how it worked for you in the UK, where you had movies you could pay money. You'd call up the cable company, and they would add a charge to your bill to watch a new movie. Kind of different from the on-demand system now, but I don't know if they had something similar in the UK to what we had in the US.
Not really. I don't remember. Like cable wasn't really a big thing. In but kind of before you got things like the kind of more on-demand services like BT or Virgin or whatever. When I was growing up in the 90s, basically you had two options. You would either have just normal television, which you would have the 4 channels that became the 5 channels, or you would have Sky, which means you would have to get like a satellite dish installed. So that, and then Sky, if you had Sky, there was like a kind of Sky Movies where you would like rent movies through Sky. But that was basically your options.
Okay, that makes sense. That actually, I think in '97, I did a school trip to England. So England and the UK. Oh no, sorry, England and Scotland. Like a kind of a school trip in '97, and I think BBC Five was kind of like just sort of becoming a thing maybe then, or it was. I just remember seeing a lot of advertisements for shows on BBC Five on like all the benches and everything.
Oh, that was in 97, that would have been the launch of Channel 5, which is unrelated to the BBC.
Okay.
It's just a pay channel. Yeah, so you're like, and it launched in 97. So there was basically up until 97 there was 4 channels, which were BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, Channel 4, and then Channel 5 launched in 97. And then obviously, BBC expanded with other TV channels later. But that was like your 5 channels. Although at the time when it first launched, there were certain parts in Scotland, including my hometown, that couldn't actually get Channel 5 without a Sky dish. So we still had the 4 channels up until the early 2000s.
Okay, all right, that makes sense. So that explains at least what I was seeing when I was there. That like it was Channel 5 was kind of being launched, and they were they were kind of
launched.
Well, here in the U.S. So you had like cable TV that had sort of like, I want to say like 30 channels, maybe 30 or 40 channels in the 90s. And you had the ones that you had to pay each month. And so like you had HBO, Showtime, Cinemax, those ones. And of course, even like ones like the Disney Channel were pay at that time. And even like my dad wanting to watch baseball and hockey, there was a sports network that those were pay. But then if you got this thing called a descrambler, you didn't have to pay the cable company, because what it did is it descrambled those channels, because that was the system that they had in place, with the channels were scrambled if you didn't pay. And that descrambler applied to pay-per-view. And so my friend we would watch, like, for example, Mike Tyson when he came out of jail. He had his big fight that was like $50 that lasted like 2 minutes. And of course, because of the descrambler, we were able to watch it for free at my friend's house. And that was how I first, watched Showdown in Little Tokyo. Was he had that was again descrambled, and then it was one of those things where I would rent it at the video store, because my parents didn't do the descrambler. I think they just there was a certain point where they were just like, we stealing cable, we don't necessarily need to do that. That's not that my parents did really anything illicit, but that was definitely one where they were like, we're not going to steal cable. So I would rent it as a movie, but. That was like a big one for me, was Showdown in Little Tokyo. And I think that also colored my view of Punisher, because I saw Punisher after Showdown in Little Tokyo and kind of liked it better. And yeah, I always had this thing with that movie, Showdown in Little Tokyo. I just always loved that movie. And so then in the early 2000s, when DVD first started being a thing, I grabbed, Showdown in Little Tokyo and had to show all my friends, you got to see this Showdown in Little Tokyo movie. And then one of my friends, or maybe it was even me, we went to this video store in the mall called Suncoast that was selling used DVDs, and got this movie from 1999 called Bridge of Dragons. It was directed by Isaac Florentine. And we just thought this was like the most amazing thing ever. I mean, he's called War Child, completely unironically. It's kind of a goofy kind of thing. It takes place in this future that's also part of the past, and none of it makes a lot of sense, but it was just a lot of fun. And that just kind of just got us into Dolph. And so that's kind of where the Dolph thing took off. And it was like early 2000s, we just were picking up every Dolph movie we could find. And the funny thing about this movie that we're going to talk about, Command Performance, is that, in this space of us throughout the 2000s being into Dolph and wanting to consume as much Dolph as we could, this was being teased, right? We were seeing trailers for this, and here's this trailer of Dolph with the spiky hair, no shirt on, drumming, and it was like this idea of like, Dolph's drumming? Like, I got to see this movie, and even that, like, we don't really have that as much anymore. Like, I don't really have anticipation for Dolph movies. It's more like I go on IMDb. Oh, Dolph has a new movie out. All right, let's see. Is it available yet? No, it's not. Okay, I'll wait till it's available and I'll rent it. Whereas this was like, oh, it's in our Netflix queues and all of that stuff. And so, yeah, Dolph had become this kind of thing for us in the 2000s where he was it was all Dolph all the time. And that was kind of where the site and everything took off, was me just wanting to talk about more direct-to-video movies that we were kind of coming into contact with through Dolph. So it is kind of funny you mentioned about Showdown Little Tokyo, because that was sort of the genesis of the Dolph thing for us.
Oh, nice. That's cool. And it's definitely having watched that this year, and also having watched I Come in Peace, which I think I might like even better than Showdown in Little Tokyo. I mean, they're both fun films. They're both fun films. But yeah, I did definitely think, oh, if I had seen these aged, like kind of 12, 13 or whatever, like I definitely think I would have got way more into Dolph, searched for more kind of Dolph films, and because like, I mean, in the early 2000s, I was watching a lot of, I watched a number of direct-to-video kind of efforts, because early on, even though before I discovered he's one of the world's biggest monsters, I was into Seagal, because I loved Under Siege, and from the moment I saw Under Siege, and same with Van Damme, I followed him into the kind of direct-to-video realm, because like he captured my imagination with, I think, like probably Kickboxer was the first film I saw by him, and it still stands as probably my favorite Van Damme film. So yeah, I would have followed Dolph into the direct-to-video if I'd saw those ones early on, because he's pretty charming in both of those, even though I would say kind of Brandon Lee does kind of steal Showdown in Little Tokyo.
Yeah, no, he definitely does. He's definitely more. There's that sense when you watch Showdown Little Tokyo with Brandon Lee that it's just like, oh, we missed out on so much with him dying so young, because he really does steal the show there. I think you're right there, because it's funny. He's like more larger than life. Dolph's more larger than life in Showdown Little Tokyo, whereas in I Come in Peace, they get someone like a Matthias Hughes to play the baddie, who is one of the few actors that you can put out there who's bigger and probably more athletic than Dolph is. Dolph is like just this towering guy who's like a supreme athlete, and it's hard to find situations where he would be getting beaten by people. But then when you create this Matthias Hughes, who I was reading about Matthias Hughes in Dark Angel, there's stuff that he does, like we've got those big boots on that he's wearing to make his character taller. And he's like doing stuff like jumping around and stuff that people were like, I can't believe he's doing this in this movie. So it adds an extra element to that film, I think, that, like you said, like when you look at some of those other ones you were talking about, I mean, yeah, Master of the Universe, Frank Langella's performance in that is just amazing. And some of the things that he wanted, like he wanted the Skeletor mask to have like a sort of an amount of give in it so that he could give facial expressions and that kind of thing. And those little touches that Langella did for that role, you're right. It kind of, whereas Dolph is kind of this one-note, long-haired guy with no shirt on who's wielding a sword. Whereas I think you're right. Like in I Come in Peace, he gets to have a little bit more personality there.
He definitely has much more personality in that film. Yeah, I think like he's just like a kind of standard muscle-bound kind of hero. I think like Master of the Universe is one of those films that I think is really kind of built around the villain, to be honest. And I do quite enjoy films like that. I enjoy the likes of Flash Gordon for the same reason. Even though I think Flash Gordon is a better film than Master of the Universe,
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, like Max von Sydow's performance is so great in Flash Gordon, and I think like even though the actor who plays Flash Gordon himself is kind of charming, but like I think that it's really stolen by Max von Sydow, and then I think Flash Gordon gets the leg up over Master of the Universe because it has like a better supporting cast, because you have those great performances like Brian Blessed and Timothy Dalton and stuff like that. But anyway, that's another tangent there. I did want to say, I guess like with the Showdown in Little Tokyo, sometimes you just got to be careful who you co-star with. Because I did also recently, not that long ago, rewatch Tango and Cash, and as much as I like Stallone, Kurt Russell runs circles around him in that film.
He does, yes. Yeah, that's a really great point because you mentioned about Flash Gordon because there was a documentary. I haven't seen it yet, but it's on this service called Tubi here in the United States that screens movies for free. But there's a documentary where they kind of go back to Sam Jones, however many years after the film and talk to him about it because his career didn't really take off the way he was expecting it to. And I think you can kind of see why when you look at all of those other performances. I mean, yeah, Max von Sydow. I mean, yeah, Timothy Dalton, who this is before he goes on to have his sort of not as successful as he was hoping for run as Bond, but at that time he's I've seen him in stuff since then too, and he really has a charming sense about him that it's a shame it didn't work out for him with Bond necessarily. But yeah, it's Sam Jones. He's young in that movie. I mean, there was he did an A-Team episode, I think 3 or 4 years after this, after Flash Gordon. So he's young, and I think he was maybe out of his I don't want to say out of his league, but with the people that he was co-starring with, they didn't exactly prop him up as much as they propped themselves up, maybe, if that's the way to think of it. And yeah, he it's a great movie, but yeah, I don't think it did for his career like he was hoping it would because of so many of these other names in the film that stood out.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. And it's not surprising. I think, because it's just he's in amongst all these things that are kind of outshining him, whether it be like Brian Blessed or Timothy Dalton or Max von Sydow or the production design or the Queen soundtrack. These are the things you remember from Flash Gordon. So it's just one of those, it's just one of those kind of unfortunate things. It's not a terrible performance. It's just like he's being outshone by a bunch of other elements.
Yeah. It was funny when you juxtapose it with like Schwarzenegger and Conan, where there's that possibility it could have been the same thing for him, but yet he's able to shine, despite a great baddie performance by James Earl Jones and some of the other stuff that's in there. And I think there's that kind of that sense of wanting that sword and sandal movie or like the big beefy hero that it doesn't matter if they don't have any personality, and you can have the baddies and the co-stars create the personality for them. But there is something I think for the poor star that's in the place there that if they don't have the personality, they don't get like kind of the love for the movie that they were hoping for.
Yeah, I think like that's interesting as well. If you compare like Masters of the Universe with the likes of Conan, I think that obviously once we get here, once we get to like this sort of film, like Command Performance, and even once we get to like Showdown in Little Tokyo, there's a bit more looseness to Dolph's performance, whereas there is a kind of slightly mechanicalness to his performance in something like Masters of the Universe. And I think that Schwarzenegger still pops in Conan, even though it's he could be outshone by the brilliant Basil Polidiris score and the great James Earl Jones villain performance and all that kind of stuff, because there is like a kind of physical charisma that he has, and also there's just like fun moments that he has that are just kind of absurd, like the bit where he like punches a camel and stuff like that. They just stand out, that make it memorable, that just give him this kind of peppering of personality that's just beyond the kind of one note kind of muscle guy.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like you're right about Dolph, like because I think Dolph comes into the world of acting, partly he wasn't planning on it, right? He was planning to be a master's chemical engineering student at MIT in the United States, and then he, hooks up with Grace Jones, and she gets him into View to a Kill, which then gets him into Rocky and Masters of the Universe. And I think part of it is because he didn't think he was going to have a career in acting. He was just doing this stuff to have fun. He probably didn't have as much input either. He probably was kind of just going along for the ride a bit and saying like, okay, if this is what you want to do, yeah, this is fine. I'm good with this kind of thing. And so he ends up playing these sort of one notes that Yeah, like by the time, like you said, like we get into these later films, or like you said here with the Command Performance, where um he's almost sort of taking a little bit more charge of his career. Like he knows, like, okay, I'm an actor now. I'm not going to be a chemical engineer or any of these other things. And so I want my personality to show in some of this stuff a little bit more. And but it yeah, those early films, they were so big, right? I mean, they're blockbusters, a Bond movie, Rocky movie, and then, the biggest toy line at the time for his first three movies. That's a huge, huge thing for him. But none of them really show his personality the way that the later films of his does.
Yeah, and from the kind of few films that I've seen, it seems like the likes of Showdown in Little Tokyo and I Come in Peace, which I think I'm right in saying are both 91, are kind of like the kind of first films that you're starting to see like his personality. Like, because one of the scenes that entertained me the most in Dolph Lundgren in Showdown in Little Tokyo, I mean, is when Dolph is in like that kind of opening scene where you kind of first meet his character. And these like hoodlums like attack him, and he's like, "Hey guys, I've not had breakfast. I'm real grumpy when I've not had breakfast." I can't remember the exact line, but like, and just from that initial kind of, I was like, I'm going to like this film. I'm going to like this performance. Like I just knew it, like yeah, that did.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And we never really get that from his first three movies. And I mean, and granted, like The Punisher was also like a really dark one. I mean, I think Dark Angel, like you said, Dark Angel and Showdown. There's one sandwiched in there, Cover Up, which is also a bit of a rough sit if you've ever. It was one he also did with Louis Gossett Jr. But yeah, I think when he starts to kind of get his personality in these movies more, and I think, as we get into Command Performance, it's one of the films that he's directed. And I think that's another piece of it for him, is that he goes through a period in the 2000s where I say probably like kind of the late 90s into the 2000s where the movies are not the best. For example, he does a movie called Agent Red that is passed with a couple directors, and a huge chunk of the beginning of Agent Red is stolen from another movie he did called Stormcatcher. And I think he's sort of seeing these kinds of things. He does a movie called Detention with I think it's Philip J. Roth. Is that it was? I mean, it's kind of a bigger name director. Sidney Furie. No, Sidney Furie. So even bigger. Who I believe, right? He did the Superman movie. Superman 4. So he's thinking he's going to be doing this fun movie, Detention. Turns out Detention is, I mean, it's just a bad, Die Hard in a school, which has like all kinds of obnoxious scenes and stuff like that. And so I think starting there in the mid 2000s, he starts to take a little bit more control and starts directing his own movies. And I think that's part of where we get Command Performance here as a movie that he's one that he directed, and I think he wanted to have a little bit more control over how he was. We could talk about a little bit of how well that comes off, because it seems like, for one thing, every female in the movie thinks he's hot, which is an interesting thing to do when you're the director and you're the stars. Have every woman tell you how hot you are in every scene. But beyond that, I think it ends up being a little bit more of a fun movie than some of those kind of earlier 2000s, late 90s ones that he did.
Yeah, it is quite a fun movie. Yes, that is quite fun. Like, so we have like these opening kind of 10, 15 minutes where we're kind of like setting, yeah, maybe even longer than that. Where we're kind of setting things up, and we're kind of prepping before the action. We're kind of establishing that Dolph is like a rock drummer, and they're at this concert that's going to be for the Russian president and his daughters, and it's got their daughter's like favorite pop star. But so we're kind of seen backstage at the gig kind of thing, and it's really strange. We have like several scenes of this pop star called Venus, who's just like perving over Dolph like all the time while they're rehearsing. And then like when he comes like backstage, trying to hit on him and all this kind of stuff. And then like even the news reporter as well. The news reporter is reporting for Russia now. She's like, "Oh, who's this handsome fellow? Let's go to talk to him," kind of thing. And it's just like really kind of weird. And like, I think we should probably mention that Dolph was like 52 at the time. The actress who plays Venus would have been like 27 at the time. I think the reporter would have been again probably in her late 20s as well. You know, like so. Yeah, it all just comes off a little weird.
Yes, right, exactly. It's an interesting thing because it's one of the interesting things I think with a lot of these name stars, and this is something that Dolph has finally started to transition out of now. But previous to this, there was still this idea of them playing somebody that was younger than they were and getting the younger girl in every film. Seagal still does that a lot, which is just, it just doesn't look good. Van Damme, I've seen movies where Van Damme, and he was born in like, what, I think 1960, 61. He'll play characters that were born in the mid 70s. And we're just buying the fact that he was born in the early mid 70s or, late 60s or whatever. But it's interesting because I saw there's a film that Mark Dacascos did called One Night in Bangkok. Not anywhere related to the Murray Head song at all, but he does this movie One Night in Bangkok where he actually plays somebody 10 years older than himself. And
that's unusual.
Yeah, again, yeah, you don't usually see that kind of thing, and it does feel like Dolph has started to now in the late 2010s into the early 2020s to sort of embrace this. But even after this film, he does a movie. He does a direct-to-video sequel to Kindergarten Cop 2 in 2016, where he's with a woman who's even younger than this actress who's playing the star in this movie. He's even younger than her. She's like born in like the late 80s, I think. And they hook up at the end of the movie. And it seems to be, and of course, this is also Dolph 7 years older as well at that point. And so there's still that vibe of that kind of thing in these movies. I guess the one difference between Kindergarten Cop 2 and this one is that Dolph just did Kindergarten Cop 2. He wasn't really part of like the production or directing it or anything like that. But yeah, there's that vibe in these movies where these action heroes who are older, and yeah, maybe in real life he probably could necessarily get a younger woman like that, but it does seem kind of smarmy when it happens constantly in the film. And it is the fact that Dolph did. I think when I saw this in '09, I was just so enamored with Dolph that it's not even that I let it go. I was just kind of like, of course, all these women are going to think Dolph's great. He's Dolph. Whereas now I'm kind of like, like Dolph, you could have toned it down a bit.
I think it's not necessarily like, obviously, Dolph is a man who works out a lot. He's in good shape. He doesn't necessarily look like young for his age because he's got a kind of weather-worn kind of face, which makes him look his age. Just his age. It doesn't look really old for his age either. He just looks his age. But it's the way it happens as well. It's not just that like even if the same age, everything's the same, and they they meet backstage and they start, and like Dolph maybe starts flirting a bit, and then the pop star kind of responds and kind of is flirty back or whatever. Even if something like that had happened, I guess I kind of would have been like, it's a bit weird because it's, such an age difference. But at the same time, I would have been like, okay, maybe, because he's a guy works out and like he's being flirty and she kind of responds because she thinks, oh, wow, this guy's kind of charming, But it's so that I could have maybe given a pass to, but it's the fact that they're like just so over the top on site, having not met him at all, just seeing the image of him, just being like, oh wow, just like leg trembling excitement, I was like, it seems a bit over the top, Dolph. Come on.
Right, it's the kind of thing that would be played for laughs in like a romp comedy in the '80s, where you have that one character that's like a male character that all the women throw themselves at. But it's done for laughs when they do it. Like, this guy he's just got a way with women and they all just love him. And it's completely not serious. Whereas here, there was no irony. At least if there was irony, it wasn't apparent, I guess is maybe the best way to think of it.
No, it wasn't front and center. I mean, these women, these women, the news reporter and the pop star, basically almost faint with excitement, because they're that into Dolph. So it is played pretty hilariously. But yeah, it seems completely unironic, which makes it kind of even more hilarious.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, I'll give a kind of a brief synopsis of the film. It's essentially Die Hard in a concert, but the idea is that Hristo Shopov plays the president of Russia, which he's. I guess in '09 we didn't know to what extent how bad Putin was. I think there was some things floating around about how bad he was in Russia. But it wasn't quite as front and center as it is now. And so the idea that Russia could, or maybe there was a message to be had there that Russia could potentially have a benevolent president if he was allowed. And this is what it would look like if he had a benevolent president, because this president is not Putin. This is a nice guy with two daughters who wants to have this pop star played by Melissa Molinaro, who she was on a show called Making the Band here in the United States, which was Diddy, Sean P. Diddy Combs. I guess I think he's just Diddy now. He was trying to put together a girl group, and so he had a bunch of young women living in an apartment in New York City, and they were filming it. And they, as the show would go on, women would be eliminated. I don't remember how far she got in it because honestly, I don't remember her as much. So I don't think she made it too far on that one, but. She's playing the pop star in this, known as Venus, and the president's kids are fans of Venus, so they want to see her perform. And then, of course, we've got Dolph, who's a drummer for the opening act, which is more of a rock act. And then there's a baddie who saw his father kill himself during, I guess it was the end of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the president, when he was younger, I guess gave papers to this guy, I guess to get him arrested or something, and he killed himself.
Yeah, it was an arrest warrant. The now president was a kind of a young judge, like a prosecutor, and he gave him, it was like handing him an arrest warrant.
Yeah, and so then this guy wants to take him hostage for revenge, and so they end up taking over the entire concert. And then Dolph, of course, is our fly in the ointment guy. We don't really know that he's like special forces or anything, right? They don't really say that. He's just like a drummer who I guess has a past in the United States that he's running from, and that's why he's living in Russia. So we're going to take a quick break here. So we'll stop here, and then we'll be back in just a minute.
Hey everyone, we'll get back to the podcast in a second, but first I have a new novel out, Holtman Arms. It follows Colvin Hall, an aspiring writer who decides to write a romance novel on a whim, sends it to a publisher, and it becomes a huge success. The only problem is, no one knows it's him because he writes under the pen name Mary Ballantyne. With all of the money and none of the fame, Colvin longs for the world to recognize his accomplishments. When he gets an opportunity to write a freelance article on a washed-up 90s pop star looking for a comeback, that recognition starts to come, but is it all he hoped for? It doesn't matter because he's getting it whether he likes it or not. Holtman Arms is the second in my author's cycle after A Girl and a Gun, and like that previous novel, it explores themes of success and accomplishment in the 21st century. You can buy it now through Amazon in paperback or on Kindle. The link is in the podcast description. As always, thanks for your support.
All right, and we are back. So Scott, I guess, sort of looking at the synopsis where we essentially have Die Hard in a concert venue. What did you think of Command performance?
Overall, I really overall I thought it was pretty fun. I thought it was for the most part. There's certain, I mean, we talked of one kind of moment of silliness that really worked for me, but with the women, but. Overall, I thought it was a kind of a fun outing. I did, when you're talking about the synopsis there, one of the things I was thinking about was, did I like that, it was a bit different where Dolph just has a past in a biker gang and that's how he knows how to fight and stuff? Like, because obviously it's always kind of silly, like the kind of classic Steven Seagal thing of like, he's whatever, he's a chef, but actually he's got a secret past as a special services guy or like a CIA guy, or like that's like the typical like Seagal type thing. And then I was like, oh well, so they didn't go that route, which is kind of silly in itself, the typical Seagal thing. But then this is also silly. So I was like, what flavor of silly do I prefer?
Yeah, it is interesting, like this idea that like, 'cause I know there was a book that Hunter S. Thompson wrote about the Hells Angels, and sort of like what
Oh
it was
yeah.
like living. Yeah, and it gives you a sense of like their level of know-how when it comes to fighting and that kind of stuff. So I guess it would work there, but you're right. It's like the Seagal one's ridiculous, right? It's always he was former CIA, DEA, whatever thing, and he just, he's always got to get pulled out of retirement, right? There's like some character actor that shows up at some seedy bar, and he's like, "No, man, I don't want to come out of retirement. If I'm coming out of retirement, I want my whole crew. I want this," and he's like giving him the whole spiel and everything. And I guess like not having that here is a change of pace. But by the
Yeah.
same token, it's like, some of the stuff that he does in this feels like it's like a level of understanding of battle areas that might be beyond just being in a biker gang.
That was my thinking as well, because like, you know, with biker gangs, I don't know if there's like outlaw biker gangs, who are maybe into kind of gangland type stuff, running drugs or whatever, because it is mentioned that his brother's killed by some Colombians. So I imagine we're supposed to infer from that as like a drug deal gone wrong or something like that. But again, I mean, they're mostly kind of bar brawler types, like they're tough and stuff, but and they know how to deal with themselves in the fight, but they're not necessarily known for their martial arts prowess, shall we say.
Well, that, and even just like sort of knowing like, okay, I'm in an environment where I need to be like scouting out here, or I need to be in this,
Yeah, the kind of tactical military note. Yeah, and
yes.
the kind of is ease with, even though it's a big plot point that he doesn't like guns, and because of his brother's death and stuff like that, and then he hunted down the people who killed his brother, and then he swore off guns after that. That's the kind of thing. So he swears off guns for, I don't know, part of this movie, until he's like, "Oh, I've just seen this table of guns. Let's have a tooling up montage," which is just stupid but fun. Like I enjoyed it. I was like, yeah, okay, he doesn't care about the gun thing now. All right, fine, we'll go with it. We're heading into the third act.
Exactly.
But yeah, no. So like there is that kind of tactical know-how that you would expect to come from military experience. You wouldn't expect to come from being in an outlaw biker gang. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because one of the things that Hunter S. Thompson talked about is that like, the bikers would have like a knowledge of martial arts in a way that like the average person might not, like, techniques and sort of, deadly techniques that, that they would pick up that, that the average person might not understand. But generally the way bikers fight is that like, if you mess with one of them, the whole crew just stomps on you. And, it's
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
what was it? The Give Me Shelter movie, where there's the concert at Altamont where you've got the Rolling Stones performing, and the people there thought it was a good idea to have the Hells Angels be security at the concert. And at one point they stomped, or they gave a concussion to I think the guitarist of Jefferson Airplane, because he was trying to get them to back off of somebody. They just whacked him. It's there's no sort of like off button for them, and and that's kind of what it is. And I think that's very different from being like a lone, like bikers aren't really known for being like kind of this Spartan sort of, send one of your best to protect the village, or to protect a city or something like that kind of vibe that we get here from Dolph, where he's a one-man army kind of person. That's a little bit different here. But, it also, I think it kind of belies this rule, because we're the number one rule of direct-to-video films is that, like, especially direct-to-video action movies, if it's fun, we forgive a lot of stuff, and we kind of just have fun with it more than, that it ruins the movie. And I think that's the one thing that happens here, right? Is that because this movie is fun, we kind of have fun with the fact that he's a biker who has like tactical know-how, special forces tactical know-how, than we do if it wasn't fun, if it was boring or something.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. But like also it being fun lets it off the hook on a lot of things. It's like and this is not the same for everybody. I have like a very particular relationship with action movies and very particular things that I like. So this won't be the same for everybody. But for me, it's kind of the same thing as like those kind of quasi-serious kind of Taken style films, right? Because like it's kind of quasi-serious some of the time, then I take it a little bit more seriously. I try and, I kind of take films on whatever terms they're kind of giving me or what I think they're giving me. So like in those films, I'll hammer them more for kind of plot inconsistencies, character inconsistencies than films like this, where I'm just like, well, it's just, it's all fun, like, so a lot of the things I just kind of like let them off the hook for.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if Liam Neeson was playing the drums in Taken, I think there are a lot of those aspects of that movie that we'd definitely forgive it. And I mean, the other thing I think too with Dolph is that because he does his own stunts for the most part, at least the martial arts scenes, he does those himself. You know what I mean? You can see kind of where age is creeping up in some of the way he's able to kick in certain parts where it doesn't look as good as it did in the past. But that also sort of lends a little bit more fun to it than it is when it's like Liam Neeson and the film is just completely like chopped up and kind of put through a blender almost and like spit out in these sort of split-second bursts. So we don't see the fact that Liam Neeson looks absolutely horrible doing these martial arts scenes. I think maybe our brain is able to manage it, or at least for me, my brain's able to manage it a little bit better when it's not such like quick, sort of edits like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a big fan of the kind of quick editing style like that. Yeah, I think you can get away with it sometimes, but I think you have to be a very skilled director. It's the kind of same thing with, and we get a bit of it here. It's the same thing with like shaky cam. Shaky cam is most of the time, 90% of the time, annoying, or even 99% of the time annoying. But there is certain examples that you can point to, something like the Bourne Ultimatum or something like that, where you're like, oh no, it was effectively employed here, or even things like Black Hawk Down kind of thing, where you're like, oh okay, kind of get away with it. But I think you need to be a very skilled director, like a Paul Greengrass or a Ridley Scott or something like that, to kind of get away with it. So I think one of the kind of minor criticisms I would have of this film is, yeah, some of the shaky cam and some of the camera work is not the best, and it can be a little bit distracting in some of the gun battles that happen.
Yeah, and I think that's another area too with Dolph as a director, where you don't know how it all works after the fact. Where I mean, I think he's kind of also leaning on his cinematographer, Mark Wind, but then I think there's a point where the film is edited in the end, and the producers get a hold of it and they start adding pieces in, or it's like one of those things where it's like, we were rushing to get the film done and we didn't shoot these things as well as we would have liked, so let's do a little shaky cam with it. And it's an interesting thing, I think, with action versus, like, for example, like direct-to-video horror or direct-to-video sci-fi, where there's an expectation of a certain level of quality from direct-to-video, unless it's like a horror comedy. People are looking at saying, like, I want good special effects, I want good makeup effects, all of that. Whereas with action movies, there is a sense of like, okay, if the movie's fun, I'm not expecting a lot when I go into a direct-to-video action movie. And it's like, if it just keeps me entertained, I'll take it. Which is I think it's a very unique perspective with movies to look at it. Like, the movie's almost going into it with a sense of like, I don't have a lot that I need to live up to the way, like horror movie. If a horror movie's bad, if it's direct-to-video, the horror community will get on it, I think, a little bit more than an action movie, if the action movie has some sort of fun element to it.
I think so. I think, like, yeah, the horror community, because the horror kind of is weird. It's kind of separate from most genres because it has its own ecosystem in a way that most genres don't. So horror has its own film festivals. It has a lot of its own review sites, a number of major review sites like Dread Central, Bloody Disgusting, The Daily Dead, things like that. that horror fans will go to above your normal review sites, being whether that's things like in the UK, things like Empire, or things like IndieWire, things like AV Club, whatever it is, these kind of more major outlets or more major reviews websites. So like, yeah, kind of horror lived in its own ecosystem. And I also think that generally, with some exceptions, because like, there's people like us talking about action movies, and there's people who are kind of nerdy about action movies. But I think for the most part, when it comes to DTV action, from my perspective, looking at them, it seems like most of them are made by people doing a job. Whereas with a lot of DTV horror, it is often they're often being made also not just for horror nerds, but by horror nerds, and particularly in terms of the special effects people and the kind of gore effects people and stuff like that. Often they are hardened horror fans themselves. So I guess that gives a little bit of a different ethos as well, of like, and it's not necessarily, I'm not necessarily criticizing, people, are out there, they're making films, they're doing a job, and and sometimes they're doing a very good job, and there's nothing wrong about that. But I just do think there is a little bit of a different ethos in terms of that wanting to be like, that kind of fanboy enthusiasm. And I think particularly with horror, particularly with people who are in that kind of doing the gore effects, doing the special effects, there is that kind of fan-like enthusiasm of, this will look so cool on screen, that maybe you don't get when making a lot of these DTV action films.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point, because, when you look at like, sort of the more successful films that have come out recently, you think of like Jesse V. Johnson as a director, who, he makes Avengement with Scott Adkins, and that's almost like a movie that's kind of exactly what you're describing in terms of like guys that are kind of nerdy, that like Jesse V. Johnson and Scott Adkins are nerdy about action movies, and they make a movie that isn't, like you said, like it's not in this mindset of like doing a job necessarily. And I mean, there's a lot of things about Avengement that your I guess I don't want to say like your average distributor would look at and say, I'm not touching this. Scott Adkins with not only an English accent, but it's like a thick English accent in the sense it's like a lot of slang terms that aren't, well known in the United States.
Sure.
The movie itself is very, very English or very British in that sense, that like a lot of times movies, when they make movies for, there's an idea of like, well, we're going to put this in the United States. It's got to be, it's got to be made for U.S. audiences. And this movie is not made, movie's not made like that at all. But yet, because it's made with that kind of love of action, it's like another level. And that's probably maybe part why, like, for example, like, Seagal's movies, he gets this director, Keone Waxman, who I always joke that he's the Seagal whisperer, because it's like he's brought in to mitigate all of the things that Seagal doesn't want to do, right? Like, I won't do my reverse shots. I'm not doing my ADR. I'm not going to be in all of these scenes. I pretty much want to sit for most of the movie. So, it's like Keone Waxman's like, okay, well, let me get another actor like Byron Mann to come in and do all the heavy lifting in this film, and I'll just intersperse it, like you said, it's like a job for him, and then he wants to go do his own movies if he can after the fact. Yeah, it's a good point, because that's a lot of times with action movies, it's sort of a line producer who comes in and says, okay, who am I going to get to make this movie? Benjamin Sachs, actually, he did an interview with Sean Malloy on I Must Break This podcast, because he had produced some of Dolph's movies, but he talked a lot about working on those Seagal movies. He gave some really good insight into that is kind of saying exactly what you're saying about it. Like, this is a job, right? And I think you're right that, like, as somebody who's watching the movie, a lot of these have almost like an assembly line quality to them. And anytime you can get a movie like this one here, that even with the assembly line quality to it, it's a fun movie. You almost have to sort of like, like got to grab onto it, just sort of take it and appreciate it for as much as you can because of that. And it is an interesting difference. And even like you talk about the ecosystem, and part of the reason why my site is more action oriented is because the horror movies that I would review, they would be buried in that ecosystem and nobody would really see them. Whereas the action ones, I'd be like one of maybe 10 people reviewing the movie, and people would come to me through that. And so, yeah, it is interesting, I think, with these movies where when you get that assembly line vibe to them, if there's anything to them that you can latch onto that makes them fun, it is a different thing versus like horror movies, like you said, where it's like somebody who really appreciates the genre is making that film.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think, like, cutting back to Command Performance, one of the things that makes Command Performance an enjoyable movie, I think, is even though the thing with the women at the start is kind of ridiculous, there is a little bit of kind of like fanboy enthusiasm in this movie, I think, from Dolph.
Yes.
Because like this movie is it's a story by Dolph, it's directed by Dolph, it's the lead star Dolph, and like Dolph in this movie is essentially leading a kind of teen boy fantasy of being like, what am I going to be in this movie? I'm going to be a biker badass. I'm going to be a rock star, because I know I read that he plays drums himself. So like, I'm going to be a rock star. All the women in the movie are going to love me. I'm going to kick ass. I'm going to save the day. And it's like, sure, Dolph, you do like if you have the opportunity to kind of live out your dreams and be like, whatever you dreamt of as like a teenager or whatever, why not? If somebody's willing to give you the money, I dreamed of being like a metal star as a kid, like I watched a lot of action movies. I was into martial arts as a kid. If I could be like a metal guitarist stroke martial arts badass and somebody be willing to give me millions of dollars to make the metal star martial arts badass Scott movie, I'd be like, sure, why not?
Right, exactly. And it's interesting because he directs this movie and then he does I think he does one more after this, the Killing Machine, which actually Icarus, aka the Killing Machine, I believe he wasn't supposed to direct that one. I believe that was supposed to be one that someone else was supposed to direct, and then he ended up taking it over. I don't remember exactly what happened there. But so this Command Performance is actually like one of the last ones that he directs for a while. Now he started to get back into directing more. But there was a sense, I think, and Sean Malloy, I think, had talked about this as well, that he had gotten to this point where he was getting these roles that he didn't appreciate or didn't like. And it's almost like he did the directing piece to kind of give himself the roles that he wanted again, that he wanted, he wanted to be able to do these movies. And it isn't kind of interesting, like that, he gets away from it, I think, because I think just in his personal life, I think he gets a divorce from his wife, and I think he needed money at that point and started just doing a bunch of stuff in the 2010s that just like, bang them out kind of, quick things. So it's almost like this is like a little taste of like the last gasp of Dolph for a while, that is kind of this fun Dolph. And then you get into this period of just like these movies in the 2010s that aren't that great, that he does, until he kind of gets big screen pictures again, where he's doing Aquaman, he's doing the Creed movie and all of that. But this is kind of like almost like an end of an interesting era for him, or interesting period in his career, that we get this sort of like this last gasp where, like you said, he kind of just has fun and gets to play out this sort of dream character that he creates.
Yeah, and he is having a lot of fun in this movie. You can tell from his performance. I mean, like, there is some performance. The performances aren't terrible across the board, but they're a bit of a mixed bag. I would say, but Dolph really. Every time he's on screen, he really lights up the screen, and you can just tell how much fun he's having playing this character, the drummer, Joe. Apparently, everybody else introduces their full name, but he always just calls himself Joe, and I was like, not have a surname? Like, is it one of those like Madonna style things that he just styles himself as Joe? Like, but yeah.
Right, because I guess the idea is he's on the run for the law in the U.S., but
Yeah.
like, wouldn't you have a fake last name then, or something? Like, wouldn't you have something that that you would need there? But yeah, it's a fascinating thing and it's also interesting that this film takes place in Russia, but he's not Russian, I don't think. Which he almost always plays Russians when he's in Russia, so that was another departure here.
That's true. No, he seems to be an American. He's called an American. He's referred to as being an American a couple of times. So yeah, that is a bit of a departure because, like you say, he's so often played Russians throughout his career. But there doesn't, it's not like I don't know. Like of the main cast, nobody's really Russian,
Right.
because like the main villain, Oleg, is played by the late Dave Lagano, who is British. And then, like, the president, Hristo Shipov, he's Bulgarian. And his friend, Mikhail, who becomes, like, his kind of sidekick, Zachary Barharov, he's also Bulgarian. So like and most of and then like his friend James Chalk, he's in it, he's also British. Like the reporter lady, Alexei, she's like the actress is like Israeli. And even like the female major who's like a part of the tactical unit, she's Polish. So like there's not really found any Russians in the cast.
Right, because I think it's the movie is shot in Bulgaria, which at that time,
yes.
that was a common thing. So what's interesting when it comes to these movies is in the 2000s, right? You get Romania, Bulgaria; those are places. I mean, obviously Seagal did tons of movies there, but that was a place where movies were shot. And then the economy falls apart. You have the sort of the global sort of recession that happens there. But in the United States, that hits a few states particularly hard. Michigan is one that really suffers. Louisiana, of course, with the hurricane, it is part of that, but they're dealing with that. Georgia is a state that had sort of like a burgeoning film, which is still kind of growing there, where it's almost like sort of like this I don't know what the right term is, but it's like sort of like a counter to Los Angeles, that Atlanta is sort of growing as a film area. And so over time it becomes cheaper. And you notice, like, especially with the Bruce Willis movies, a lot of those ones are shot in the United States because it ends up being cheaper to shoot in Michigan or in Louisiana or one of those areas. And you lose this sort of this Eastern European thing that was happening a lot in the 2000s. And this is kind of one of the last ones in there, in that area. But it was always this thing. It's always kind of a fun thing when you watch some of these movies that take place in either Bulgaria or Hungary or something like that, and you see, like, this one did a good job. I think, again, Dolph was always very cognizant of some of those little touches, but this one did a good job of not showing us anything that had like signs that were in like Bulgarian or something like that. They were just obviously not Russian. This one didn't have that as much, but you see that especially in the Seagal ones where you'll just be like, okay, that's definitely not something in Russian or something like that.
Yeah, no, I did notice, because like a couple of months ago, I watched another Dolph film, and that he directed, The Mechanic, and I do remember that I think there's like a car chase or something there where they're like going through a city, and like there's clearly like a Bulgarian flag waving in the background. You're like, so like I was aware that there was a lot of DTV action that was filmed in Bulgaria at this time, and it's funny because like anytime I'm doing recording a podcast about a film, I always end up going down like IMDb rabbit holes, and I discovered that this was made in 2009, that there was about half a dozen people in the cast of this film that were also in the 2009 Val Kilmer film, which I've not seen, Double Identity. So like,
Yes,
so they're really spreading the cast thin.
Yeah, well, in particular, I recognized Hristo Shapov, who plays the president in this, because I did that movie for Francis Rizzo III has a podcast, the Kilmer Cast, where he does kind of all the films of Val Kilmer, and he's had me on to talk about some of his direct-to-video movies, and yeah, we talked about that one.
I
Which is
listened to that episode. That's it. So I've not seen the film, but I have listened to that episode of Kilmer Cast.
Yeah, it's like what was it? They weren't Doctors Without Borders. They were something else.
Oh yeah, I can't remember what the organization was, but it was supposed to be basically Medicine Sans Frontier, but
Right.
But using a different name.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing too is, of course, France. He's from Long Island, so obviously New York City. He knows it really well. And at the end of the movie, they just dress up some part of Romania to make it look like New York City, and it was like, it's like, yeah, what was that supposed to even look like? Like, what part of New York was that supposed to be? Yeah, you always see that kind of thing, and I guess that's the thing too with Americans, right? Is that we, Americans generally aren't as worldly, and so we would know the difference between Bulgaria and Russia. So just, whatever, Eastern Europe, it's all the same to us, and so just throw it together in there like that. Whereas actually, for the people who watch these action movies, we actually have fun seeing some of those little mistakes that they make with those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think it was. I guess this movie gets away with it because most of the action happens within the concert hall. Yeah. So it avoids all that. It avoids all the kind of Bulgarian flags waving in the background, or signs clearly not in Russian or whatever. And then they can, because they're in the concert thing, and they can, they can make Russian signs or whatever. And so I think that it avoids a lot of that. Although it is quite funny because I guess the kind of humorous aspect is that it's weird, having watched all these action movies, from the 80s to the present day, I am now not convinced I know what a Russian accent is, because all I'm aware of is watching action movies and British and American actors doing this voice. I am Russian, yes. And I'm I'm not sure that's necessarily a Russian accent. I've heard Russian people speak. I'm not, but when I think Russian, that's the accent I think of because I've seen so many action movies. So
Yes. Well, yeah, it's interesting because I taught English as a second language for a period of time, and I still kind of work in that industry. But I remember I would have students from Russia, and yeah, hearing them talk, one of the things that a lot of times people doing the accent miss is that articles. They have a lot of trouble with articles because I guess in Russian they don't really have them. So it's not like, I watched the game. It's like a watch game, and stuff like that.
Right.
But there are a lot of other aspects of the language that, yeah, they just use, like you said, just the accent, but they don't, there's a lot of things that they miss that native speakers just, naturally have when they speak the language. And so, yeah, it's kind of funny. You have the Dolph Lundgren "I Must Break You" or something like that as kind of the best interpretation of a good Russian accent. But yeah, it is funny that we don't really have. I guess there's this guy Andrew Nevsky who has been making his own action movies, who is Russian, and so I guess he's probably the best bet that we have for a good Russian accent if we watch one of his movies.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. And there was a Russian action movie that I saw a couple years ago that was really good. That was kind of a kind of Russian action black comedy. And now I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, yeah. So I have heard real Russian accents. I think the guy's name was Kirill Sorkov.
Oh yes, yeah.
Yeah. Sokolov, Kirill Sokolov.
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't you just die? It was the name of the film.
Right.
Always the most exciting part of any podcast episode. Frantic Googling.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm trying to see if that's Oh, you actually can rent it on Prime here in the U.S. That could be a really interesting one. I like
Oh no,
that.
it's a great film. It's really
Is
funny.
it?
It's got lots of bloody action. It mainly takes place in one apartment building, but it really makes the most of that space. It's a great fun time. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like it. It looks like this could be a good one. I'll have to check this one out because, like I said, it's available to rent for like $2 here in the U.S., which isn't bad for a rental on Prime. So yeah, and it might be available to stream. You never know with that kind of thing if a streaming site will have it as well. So that yeah, that one definitely looks like a lot of fun. It's funny. Yeah, you talk about the Russian accent because it's mostly Northern Europeans who play Russians, right? If it's not Brits or Americans doing the accent, right? It's Schwarzenegger or which I guess I don't know if is Austria considered Northern Europe. I guess it's
No,
kind
not
of
really. It's kind of
yeah.
middle Europe. No, no, Northern Europe is really like you're talking really the Scandinavian countries, or like like kind of or things like Iceland.
Yeah,
Things like that. That's kind of more Northern Europe. I presume. I mean, I guess Scotland's Northern Europe too.
right. That's good point. Right. Yeah, we were right. It was it's funny here in America. They use this term continental a lot to describe like things being like really nice or something like that, and it's like they don't it's always kind of funny whenever I hear continental being used like actually as like what it's meant to be as terms of like Europe versus like the British Isles. And it is kind of funny like yeah the in America yeah it's like the continental this or the continental that it's supposed to be like some kind of luxurious thing or some like nicer version of something as opposed to just it's like the continental Europe versus the islands or something like that.
Yeah. I guess like I think in English that is a term that is used like I I guess it is made to use as like the difference between like the British Isles or like continental Europe, but then it's also employed in a kind of like to mean kind of classy or whatever because like
Right,
you kind of it kind of infers kind of classiness like when where when you go to a hotel and they have a continental breakfast which just means like it's like a French it's like a croissant or whatever it's like it's some
right,
French or whatever like
right,
but like it does sound kind of classy but it's just
right.
like no it doesn't really mean so.
Right, right. Yeah, it's funny. I saw something recently that was sort of joking about sort of the perceptions of people from from the UK, sort of around the world, and sort of like in America, right? There's sort of like this BBC buttoned up image of this is what English is. It's this nice like BBC TV shows and Oxford English and all of that. And like in Europe, it's somebody who's drunk and passed out, and the cops trying to wake them up at like 4 in the morning, because they're sort of like the ugly tourist there. And it is kind of funny how in America, like, yeah, we sort of have this view, I think, just because of our history as like Westerners who aren't Westerners, that like we sort of aspire to that European history, but yet at the same time don't quite have it, and so there's that idea of it's all so much more sophisticated across the pond, and I
I
think
think
yeah, usually
I mean you even get that in terms of like culture that like that is like presented to the world
yes,
particularly with the English or whatever. Like that does tend to be like the two thing, like you either get like the kind of what I call the kind of posh hussies dramas, like you get like the kind of Downton Abbey type thing,
yeah,
or you get like the kind of social realist type thing. You get the kind of council estate kind of Ken Loach stuff,
right,
um, or or you get the kind of like cutting back to something like a avengement, you get the
yeah,
kind of what is often classified in in British culture as kind of geezer films,
yeah,
and Avengement is a cut above your average, well, a cut above your average kind of geezer film, because like that's a lot of what the DTV market in the UK is like in England is like that's what that is. It's like kind of low rent gangster films.
yeah,
Like that's like that's a lot of what the direct to video market is in the UK. Kind of like snatch knockoffs, or things that are like the kind of like obviously the kind of best examples of the British gangster films are the things like Snatch or Sexy Beast or whatever, but these are kind of much lower down the tent pole kind of thing.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, because that's the interesting thing with Shogun Films with that movie Nemesis they did recently, where they were sort of taking that idea of the DTV gangster film and trying to make something a little different with it, like with Billy Murray kind of like playing kind of a more enhanced role, and that the different actors playing more enhanced roles than that. Because because we get a lot of those movies here in the U.S. It's Craig Fairbrass kind of movies where or Nick Moran, you just get a good chunk of them, and like you said, it's easy to kind of go through a bunch of them at once, and see them all. And I think in the U.S. we're kind of devolving with DTV stuff being like these Bruce Willis formulaic films that are just pumped out like 5 or 6 a year, and just get whatever actor that used to be popular in the States, put them on the marquee with that name, and just pump it out there and see how many streams it can get.
Yeah, for sure. And I was I think like it's good though that like with a movie like Avengement, that the likes of Craig Fairbrass, who actually isn't a terrible actor. Like he's kind of an okay screen presence, getting a little bit more opportunity to do something he can cut his teeth into, because a lot of them are just terrible. Like, I kind of feel sorry for actors like Craig Fairbrass and Nick Moran and Billy Murray, who aren't terrible actors, but are generally the name person in an awful gangster film.
Right. Well, because that was the thing with Nemesis, where Nick Moran's playing this disgraced police officer, and you could tell, like you said, like he just really wanted to sink his teeth into this role because he was just so happy to be doing something other than some guy at a pub telling somebody to kill somebody else or something like that. Yeah.
And actually, talking of kind of British actors, I was wondering what you thought of Dave Lagano as the villain, Oleg, because I was a little bit not disappointed, but like he's like a solid screen presence, but having watched a lot of action movies and a lot of kind of DTV action as well, he feels like the main henchman rather than the main villain. And I don't know if you got that same sense.
Yeah, no, I definitely did. Like when I first watched this movie, actually, this is a really great point that you bring up here, because when I first watched this movie, I think I was expecting somebody within like maybe the president's inner circle or somebody like that to be the real like leader of this, because of the way Lagano's character was portrayed in here. And I wonder now, as we're talking about this movie almost being a vehicle for Dolph, if he left that baddie character, if he kind of left a little to be desired there with that. Because I think you're right with Lagano, it would have been nice to have seen him be a little bit more of that fun, diabolical, diehard baddie that we didn't get here.
Yeah, that's true. And like, it's interesting the way the film sets up, I think, because after the initial takeover of the concert hall, we get this tactical military unit who turns up outside the concert arena, and there's a kind of stationary unit with a bunch of computers and stuff that people are working on. That we've got some CIA agents, we got like a general from the army, we've got this female major who seems to be doing the majority of the work, and nobody else seems to be doing much. And then we've got what we seem to, I think, must be the defense secretary. People just refer to him as Mr. Secretary in his scene. So I think he must be the defense secretary. Now, he is very much costumed like a villain. He's got like a coat kind of draped over his shoulders like a mafia boss. He is very dramatically smoking a cigarette in a cigarette holder, and he's always kind of in a dark corner in the room, kind of just muttering orders. And I was like, oh, he's got to be one of the villains, right? Because like he's dressed exactly like a villain you would dress a villain, and then he's just not.
Yeah, no, yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because I kind of forgotten that when I watched this, because I saw it back around 09, 2010 when it first came out and reviewed it for the site and all of that. And I'd kind of forgotten watching it this time through that I had that vibe when I watched it the first time that like this baddie can't be the baddie. And I think you're right. I think he was one of the ones, the secretary was one of the ones um that there was a sense of like one of these characters has got to be like the real baddie here, right? That there has to be somebody else who's like really in charge, that there's a plot twist coming, but then it never happens. And I don't know if maybe there was originally supposed to be a plot twist and it was left on the cutting room floor in the interest of keeping the runtime short. I'm not sure what happened there, but yeah, it felt like there should have been something there with the way that they presented the baddie in this film.
Yeah, I do think so. It does feel like there should be more of a twist there. And I think
Yeah.
the other thing that I thought was weird is the female Major Pavlikova.
Yeah.
She discovers Oleg's background.
Yeah.
And I found that very strange that Oleg's background as the son of the general who killed himself and killed his wife in the opening scene, he's like the son of that general. And this is all about revenge. And that when the major is telling you that, that is presented as if it's a twist, but then because we've seen the opening scene and then we saw the villain, the audience, I mean me, have already put two and two together and already think he's the son, so we kind of already know it's for revenge. So I'm like, so do you think this is a twist? Because watching it doesn't feel like a twist. I feel like I already know this information and the characters are just catching up with the audience now.
Right, which is always a rough sell, right, in a movie when it's like that, when we already know what's going to happen and we're just waiting for them to figure it out. It's almost like Chekhov's openings, Chekhov's like whatever, the scenes. Like we knew if they're going to give us a scene to open the movie with, it's almost like it should have come when she was giving the reveal, right? That's when we should have had the scene that we opened the movie with. It would have
Yes,
made more
because
sense there as a
that would have
twist.
made sense. Like
Yeah.
that would have made sense to me if the opening scene was cut and put later in the movie when we're getting the flashbacks to that opening scene, when the major is giving the reveal. Because if you cut the opening scene and you see the gang operating the way they are, the mercenaries operating the way they are, and they're drilling into things and and then you do think it's all about money. You think it's all about money. So if you just take that opening scene out, then it is a twist because the audience, believe that this is about money. They're just trying to take people hostage, get more money. There's maybe some money in the concert, or whatever. And you're just like, this is just for ransom. And then you're like, oh no, it's for revenge. And it would have been like a pretty easy thing to do. Like it's a very short scene. Just don't have it the start of the movie.
Yeah, because it's almost like with Die Hard, if the beginning of the movie, Hans is telling the gang, like, yeah, we can't wait to get these bonds that we can, these whatever the money that we're going to get, and we're going to pretend to be terrorists, right? And then when the twist happens later, it's like we want Bruce Willis to find out, like, no, Bruce, these guys aren't doing this for hostages or whatever. They're doing it because they want the money. It's kind of the same idea, right? If you give us that reveal at the beginning, yeah, it's a good point. It's one that I didn't. It's not that I guess it's not that necessarily that I didn't catch it. It was like almost like I was like, well, of course, yeah, this is what these guys are doing here. But you're right. It was like it can be kind of a. I think if the movie didn't have as many fun moments that it had in between, where Dolph is dispatching baddies and he's fighting with these characters, with beating people up with guitars and things like that. You'd look at it and be like, come on, just figure this out. Like, yes, we all know what these guys are here for. Or even it could have been a better plot twist too. I think with James Chalk's character, if he was just like maybe that these characters didn't know that that's what this main character wanted for his wasn't, the motivation for holding the president and his daughters hostage. Like that would have even been for a better plot twist with James Chalk, because we get that plot twist where James Chalk's character decides to turn state's evidence, or he's going to sell them out to cut a deal with the authorities. It would have made more sense if he's like, oh, they're not doing this for money. I'm not getting any money out of this. Yeah, well then the hell with this guy. I'm gonna sell him out. That would have made that plot twist make more sense too.
I do think that is quite interesting the way they set that up. I do think that kind of almost works, because we do get a sense that these guys are not necessarily like Oleg's boys kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
You do get a sense that Oleg has kind of collected a bunch of mercenaries, some of whom may know Oleg's plan, some of whom may not. You do get that sense of like there is, because there's like there's some guys who clearly are just thinking it's all about money, so like are a bit confused when Oleg is like, haha, I'm going to blow everything up, and people are like, what? No, huh? So like there is a sense of that these are just guys that Oleg has hired, and they're not necessarily like Oleg's army kind of thing. Yeah. So I think that's done pretty well, even though it is quite funny that like there is a certain point kind of just after they've taken over the concert arena. And also I was just thinking about like watching this movie, I was thinking like there is a bit just after they take over the concert arena, when you see people like kind of running and fleeing out the concert doors, and it was at that moment, before I was just like having fun with it, and like after it I was just kind of having fun with it as well, but there was that one specific moment where you see all these people running out the concert doors, and I was like, shit, yeah, you couldn't make this film now, because like it's just like one of those things that like after the Bataclan attack in Paris and the Manchester Arena attack in the UK, it's just like, people would not, I think people would react against this film in like a different way, that like obviously in 2009, you wouldn't have had, you didn't have those like concert attacks that you had in the mid to late 2010s with ISIS. So like I think people would be more uncomfortable with certain scenes in this movie than they were in 2009, or I would have been in 2009. But I don't think it spoils it. I don't think it takes away from it. There was just a couple of moments in the initial concert arena takeover that I was like, ugh.
Well, because what they probably would, the way they probably would have mitigated it now is they wouldn't even be allowed to fill the concert yet, right? Like they probably would have done they may have had like a concert sequence in a different city, and then she's coming to do the concert here, and before the concert even starts, that's when the takeover happens. And
they probably do something like that, to kind of mitigate those kind of screaming crowds coming out of an arena kind of thing. Yeah,
because you're right. Like I think that's one of the things I think with these movies is that they, especially with the action movies, that they always try to be more extreme than what could really happen, with this idea in mind that like, okay, if we're more extreme and it's just so completely outlandish, it maintains this fantasy element to it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and then there's always that sense of like, okay, well, no, then reality starts to catch up with some of these things. I mean, especially here in the United States with mass shootings happening constantly. I mean, that's another piece here, at least this is a little bit different because it is sort of like a controlled takeover kind of thing. But yeah, there's always that sense of like wanting it to be larger than life, like that, big explosions, big, but then there's always that mindset of like, is what we're doing, could it have a sort of a triggering effect on, situations that have happened in the world that make us look like we're not sensitive to those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always got to be that kind of, because you don't mind watching something that's got like that kind of elevated, and I don't mean elevated in terms of like classy or whatever, but I mean elevated in terms of like being fantastical, because you can be like, oh well, that's not real life. People don't People don't like their heads don't explode like watermelons like that. Or certain things, these certain things don't happen. You watch a movie like Commando, I guess is a good example of like, it's so outrageous, it's so over the top, you can't take any of it seriously as being part of like grounded reality, so you just roll with it. And yeah, so there is always that kind of dangerous edge. And if the film does have weaknesses, I think that one of the weaknesses is the couple of moments it tries to be gritty, like it doesn't work. I think like there's a lot of fun to be had with this movie, and we should probably talk about some of the most fun scenes straight after this. But I think the moments that it tries to be kind of heavy or emotional, or like it tries to be kind of or it tries to kind of push buttons, I don't think it works. I don't think the scene, there's a scene where Dolph kind of comes in the concert hall and he kind of trips and falls, and then he kind of sees all these dead bodies in amongst the crowd and stuff like that, and he's kind of like taking it in, and I think it's supposed to be like a big kind of emotional scene, but because the rest of the movie is so kind of tonally light, that it feels like too much of a gear shift.
Yeah, especially when you start getting to like innocent people body counts, right? That's it's one thing when it's like paid, whether it's paid guards or paid henchmen, and they're kind of getting gunned down with an Uzi and they're kind of shimmying, or like, baddie who has an active role in trying to kill Dolph, and Dolph, shoves a knife through his head or something like that. That's more fun. But when it's like poor innocent concert goers that are getting gunned down in going to see a concert, that's a little, like you said, it's a little grittier. And that was one area where, for me, I think there was a moment that was kind of a little bit sort of triggering with, one of the school shootings that happened recently here in the United States in Uvalde, Texas, where one of the girls to survive pretended that she was dead by like covering herself in blood, which is something that Dolph does in this film, right? He drapes himself in one of the dead bodies and pretends that he's dead while the baddies go through the area. And of course, they also gun down an innocent concert goer who, I guess there was that sense in an action movie too, where if you're not smart enough, you deserve to die. And this character who panics and like runs through the theater, the seating area, while the baddies are doing their final sweep to see who's still alive, and gets killed. I think that's another area of these movies that I don't always like, this idea that someone's complicit in their own death.
I don't necessarily like that either. And I think the other thing, and it happens quite a lot it can happen in, like these kind of horror movies or DTV action or horror. But things that happen in films that are edgy for the sake of being edgy, I don't like. And there is one scene in this movie that I felt was really unnecessary, and I kind of reacted against, and that was, there was a moment where one of Oleg's henchmen is kind of like, oh, what are we doing? Why are we still hanging about? Where's the money? Kind of thing. And he's obviously a bit bored and a bit frustrated. And he then grabs one of the Russian president's daughters, who's actually played by Dolph Lundgren's own daughter, who would have been about 13 at the time. And she's kind of like, Dolph and Venus are around and kind of hear her screams. And I think it's essentially insinuated that this henchman was about to rape this 13-year-old. Yeah. And I was like, no, movie. No, there's no reason. This is just, you're just being edgy for the sake of it. Like, you're just throwing this out here to create extra tension and dread, and like, no, I don't like that.
Yeah, and I think there is always that. I think for Dolph, maybe the fact that it was his daughter, that he maybe felt like, okay, I'm gonna put my own daughter in this situation rather than having somebody else's child actor be in that situation, and maybe that was part of it. But you're right, it wasn't necessary. Like, we didn't necessarily need it in the film. But also too, I mean, there's something about action movies that I think I always get a kick out of, is this idea that like, okay, these two young girls go through this extremely traumatic experience where they're being held hostage. Like you said, there was an attempted rape in one situation. But then at the end of the film, they're just completely fine. And they're like, here, Dolph, can you autograph our CD and all of this kind of stuff? And there's always that sense that like, once the hero saves the day, all of the other stuff is completely done and gone and it doesn't matter. And it's always fascinating, right? That yeah, there's no PTSD that comes as a part of any of that. And I think that's part of what they do here with this thing too. I think that as well, that's like, oh, she's being assaulted by this guy, this gross guy here, but she'll be over it by the end of the movie and be perfectly fine. There's not going to be any lingering effects to that. And so it's like on the one hand, they're being dark, right, for the sake of being dark. Mm-hmm. But then on the other hand, there's no ramifications to that darkness, right? It's dark for the sake of being dark for a minute, and then we're okay again. Which I always think with action movies, it's like, there are a lot of times where there are women who do get raped in movies where it's just sort of like, they kill the guy who did it and they're perfectly fine at the end, when it's like, that's not really how that works. There's no reason, they could just not go there and not have to worry about any of it.
Yeah, and it always feels quite ugly that, like, right. I obviously because she's 13, obviously they wouldn't do anything, they obviously wouldn't do anything in that area, but. There's always something quite ugly about the kind of cheap use of that, and it's like, even though Kickboxer is my favorite Jean-Claude Van Damme film, they use that kind of thing that is like a weirdly semi-regular trope in kind of 80s and 90s action movie, or what I would call the inspirational rape, that's really only there to motivate our hero more and has nothing to do with the woman, which feels disgusting.
Yeah, exactly. And it's almost like this film was just sort of skirting on the edge of it, because it's almost like they felt like they had to. Like they felt like it's almost like Dolph felt like he needed to have some darkness in the movie when he really didn't. The movie didn't need it. It would have been perfectly fine without it. I think we would have been perfectly fine with, the girls not even being hassled by. And I guess he needed his daughter to have the scene where she's being held hostage by the baddie and he has to somehow navigate that to get, to take her out. But yeah, you're right there. It kind of all felt a little bit off in that sense. And it was, like you said, tonally, the rest of this film is just like goofy Dolph drumming, women saying how hot he is, him like with great one-liners. Like what was the line about, dying is easy, rock and roll is hard.
Which is also the tagline for the movie, I discovered, which is great. And like there's lots of fun things. I mean, like Dolph apparently has like Michael Myers super strength in this movie, because like the first guy he kills, he impales him with a drumstick that goes up through the guy's throat and through his eye. So he like sticks it into the guy's throat and up through his eye. You're like that. I mean, with a drumstick, like. Yeah. It's amazing. So like, and there's lots of goofy fun like that, and he's like, even when he was fighting that guy, and he's like, "Hey, what's the hair, dude?" And like, I loved all of that stuff.
And I love that we have Chekhov's abs in this, right? Where he's got he's shirtless for a good chunk of the film, where he's just wearing this open vest, and they're showing off his six-pack quite a bit, and it's like, if you're going to show a six-pack throughout most of the movie, then the baddie has to slash said six-pack in the final fight scene. And so the baddie's got his knife, and of course, just cuts right through, just slashes the abs. And of course, those are those injuries in action movies that are considered superfluous, that actually could be like really damaging in real life. But it's like, yeah, if we're going to show these abs off, we've got to use them somehow at the end of the movie. And I thought that was great too. And it was, like you said, it was Dolph wanted to show off that, hey, I've been working out still, which I think when you compare him to Seagal, who it was not in the best shape, at that time. it was a sense of like, hey, I'm in my 50s here, but I can still really do this kind of thing. And I kind of appreciated that, but it was kind of a fun thing too, that he was like, I'm not going to really wear much in terms of clothing for my upper torso.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he is very much dressed like a kind of he's very much dressed like a kind of a rock star, but like a rock star of his age. Like he is still dressed like a kind of rock star of the 80s who's not moved with the times.
Right.
Like, like so he is, he's still kind of age appropriate in that sense, I guess. Like, but like so yeah, he kind of matches up, but like he's having a lot of fun. Like you say, obviously he is a bit older. He can't do quite what he could do in the early 90s in terms of the kicks and stuff, but he's still kicking ass with the action. There's a lot of fun action scenes, but even like his acting, I think is fun in this movie. Just the way he plays the character. Like there's like little interactions that I really loved. Like there's a bit near the end of the movie where he's trying to save the president, and he comes into the room where the rehearsal room where the president is being kept hostage, and he says, "How are you doing, dude? I mean, sir."
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we got a kick out of. I mean, there's a scene where he's smoking weed, and he kind of has to like stop midway through, and that's sort of how I think it's right. It's the fact that he's smoking weed that gets him into that flying the ointment role.
Yeah, it is because he goes into the bathroom, and then he does like the thing I love about that scene is like when the terrorists, like when everything kind of kicks off, like the bathroom, there's like an explosion which kicks open the bathroom door, and the bathroom door like falls on top of Dolph, and then Dolph gets up and does like the airplane gag of like, I really need to give this up.
Right. Yes. Yes. Right. Yeah. There are a lot of those touches. And I think that's the thing with Dolph when he's directing his movies. And again, this is also part his screenplay as well, that he kind of, I mean, again, like we talked about, there's some tonal issues, but overall, the movies tend to be a little bit more solid in this sort of fun DTV realm when he's making them. And I think this was like a really great example of that like you get those little touches here and there that he made sure were in the film. That you may not necessarily get if it's like you talked about, where it's a director who's just doing a job. Dolph is just there doing a job. Everybody's just there to just kind of bang this thing out and get it on the shelves as soon as possible. This has a little bit more personality to it, which I definitely appreciated.
Yeah, and I think like there's some really fun action set pieces as well, because when like the guy who becomes his kind of buddy, Mikhail, he kind of first meets him when him and Mikhail's like mentor are about to be executed in a kind of live video execution. And then Dolph is backstage. He turns up all the things on the soundboard, and then he lets out this almighty guitar riff. And it's like kind of done in this like when he does the guitar riff, like everything kind of slows down. It kind of almost freeze frames on him like ripping this guitar, and then like you got he's in all his glory. We're really checking out his abs and his frosty tips, and like and then he bum rushes the stage, breaks a guitar right over a guy's head, and then with the same guitar, he's still got part of the guitar in his hand with the strings, and he impales a guy with the rest of the guitar after smashing the guitar over his head. And it's just like there's just moments like that that's just glorious stuff right there.
Yeah, and you don't always get that with the direct-to-video movies that are made today. That like they don't always have that sort of inspired piece. It's really just about like, let's line people up with guns on either side, shoot as many times as possible, have someone get hit, fall over, that kind of thing. And it was one thing that was nice about this that Dolph did, was that I think he did play with the space, but he wanted to make sure that there was a rock and roll element to this film. Whether it was like you talked about with that scene, I mean, he stabs the guy with guitar sticks, I believe, as well. That kind of thing where I think he didn't want it to just be Die Hard in a concert venue, but he wanted there to be that element of music involved with it that I really appreciated.
Yeah, he did kind of use the environment. I did enjoy that part of it, particularly, obviously once we get into the third act, he does decide that he's going to get back on the guns. He's
Yes.
fine with it now. He's overcome it all. Is kind of aversion for guns that he's apparently had for years in about an hour. But like, it's fine. It's fine. And so yeah, there is that. But before we get to the guns, he does use the environment and like. He does almost like, what I think of as like the Jackie Chan thing, and he just uses the nearest things to him. So he's got drums, he's always carrying drumsticks around. So, he impales a gang with a drumstick, as I mentioned, and, he hits a guy with a guitar. And, and so there is this kind of interaction with the kind of musical environment. There's really fun in the first half of the film. And I think like that great kind of freeze frame moment on that epic guitar riff that's one of my favorite moments of the film. Although I will mention as well that in terms of the action sequences, and I know that Dave Lagano was an MMA fighter before he became an actor. Which is why he uses like the triangle chokehold at one point, which in 2009, very MMA moves, very popular. A lot of triangle chokeholds, a lot of arm bars. Like it seemed like a heavy time for MMA moves in action movies. But the fight there, even though Dolph is more restricted in terms of his kicks, and so it's a more of a kind of punch heavy fight, I think like it's a really good fight there as well.
Yeah, I think he appreciated having Logano there to do these fight scenes, which I thought was really cool. I think that was one thing about Dolph. I think because he was a practitioner, before he became a film star, he always appreciates that part of fighting. And I think he wanted to sort of incorporate some of those things. I mean, I think he had worked with Arlovsky, I think. So kind of around the time of this, I think.
Because I think that's the same year. Because I think that's Universal Soldier Regeneration. I think that's
right.
I think that's also 2009. Yeah, and
yes.
that's Andrei Arlovsky. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I actually saw Arlovsky fight in a UFC event. The only UFC event I've ever been to was in Connecticut in 2005, I believe, or 2006. I think it was 2005. But Arlovsky was the heavyweight champ at that time, and he was fighting this other guy, Paul Buentello. And we're up in the kind of in the higher up seats area, and we're watching as they're fighting. Buentello, it looks like Arlovsky has like ducked down to give him like a takedown. And then the ref comes in and stops the fight, and we're all booing. We're like, why did you stop the fight? He's just giving him a takedown. And then what we saw was that Arlovsky actually punched him, caught him cold on the chin, and knocked him out. And then he was ducking to get out of the way of this falling heavyweight who was landing on him. It was like a 15-second fight. It was over that quickly. So I always remember. I mean, I saw Arlovsky. We were, my friend and I were eating at a restaurant in the casino where the event was being held, and we saw Arlovsky come in to get food. And I mean, he just, it's kind of it'd be interesting to see if he ever kind of kind of grew into being more of an action guy. But I mean, yeah, he was just an immense fighter, and I could see like how Dolph would have probably wanted to take some of those elements from working with him and working with Logano to sort of add those pieces, add those touches in. And I did kind of like those a little bit, like you said, the triangle choke, things like that. And especially for someone like him, where like sort of his lower torso and the kicks aren't what they used to be, he could add those elements in and make it still more exciting.
Yeah, I absolutely. And also we get like I feel like they kind of missed an opportunity because like basically Logano's character Oleg gets impaled by like a kind of steam pipe, and I was expecting like a Commando style payoff line, which never arrived. So I was like, oh.
Yeah, it's almost like it was an ode to Commando without fully being that ode, right? Like I guess he didn't want to go that far to be telling him to let off some steam. But the funny thing is he didn't have any one-liner about that, really, which I was kind of hoping with the one-liners that he'd had throughout the film that he would have had something for when he dispatched the baddie.
That's what I was expecting. Because like there's been like kind of one-liners throughout the films and like bits and pieces and the kind of like don't touch the hair kind of thing, and there are various lines in that way. So not necessarily like going straight for like the commando like let off some steam, but like I was just expecting some sort of payoff line because there'd been a number of death payoff lines kind of throughout the movie. So I was like, oh well, the main villain has to get one, like, but apparently not.
Yeah, right. I know because that's one of the all-time greats, and because Commando is kind of the same thing, right? That it's like constantly sort of like these build-ups, right? Sort of these great one-liners. I had to let him go, or he's just taking a nap, or whether he's just sleeping or something. I can't remember because he kills that guy, and it kind of makes it seem like he's sleeping.
He's having a nap or whatever. Yeah.
And so when we get to the point where Bennett gets knocked through the steam pipe there, you needed that line, and we get it right with the let off some steam, Bennett, or we never quite get that here with that. It is interesting, like out of all the things that maybe, I don't know if he just couldn't think of a good one there, because or maybe there's just nothing better than let off some steam, and so he wanted to leave
I guess
it
so.
there. I don't know.
Maybe there isn't.
Yeah. Well, Scott, as we wrap up here, was there anything else in Command performance that you wanted to mention?
I'm trying to think now. No, I think we've covered pretty much everything, all the points I had in mind to discuss, both in terms of the positives and negatives. And even though I do want to mention, for the benefit of your listeners, that I should say that I did overall enjoy the movie. And I thought it was a fun movie. I think there is a number of entertaining action sequences. I feel that you really get on board of just how much fun that Dolph is having. Oh, and also, I knew immediately that I was going to enjoy this film or like this film because, like any great cheesy action movie, the credits exploded onto the screen.
Yeah.
The title credits come up and then the screen explodes, and I was like, "Oh, that's a classic move right there. Well done. I'm clearly going to be on board."
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. That Dolph makes this movie in the vein of an action movie geek, the way you were talking about with horror films, and I think that just like it makes for a really fun movie. And I think this is one, I've had the guys from Compass on. We've done what we call the unsung Dolph, where we talk about the Dolph movies that people don't necessarily talk about, and I think this is one that made one of my lists because it's not one that people talk about as much, but it is a really fun one. And when you go through Dolph's filmography, you can really hit some rough ones. And this is definitely not a rough one. This is one that, we have, it's not a perfect movie. It has definitely some things to call to the carpet, but overall it's a fun time. And it's a great way. I think, if you're looking for a 90-minute time killer, this is definitely there. And I think it's even kind of a fun one if you got people over for a weekend night or something like that, and you're looking for something fun. I think there isn't too much in this one that could really be off-putting, that in a mixed group that they'd be like, I can't watch this. This is too much.
I absolutely agree. And even some of the negative things that we've discussed, I think like you kind of let it off the hook for a number of those things. And then when you actually get to the end of the movie, when Dolph is in his arm sling because he's been shot in the shoulder, which again is one of those action movie things where everybody can just shake off being shot in the shoulder. But anyway, and then he's like signing CDs because apparently the president's daughters are secret fans of his band, and the president's also a fan, and they're playing one of the songs. And then he gives Dolph a watch, or the character Joe a watch that on the back of it says "Rock and Load." And at the end, he goes into a limo with the pop star Venus, who he's now dating in a business partnership with. We're not sure. And then he just kind of, in respect of the watch, he just kind of points to the screen and just says "Rock and Load," and then we just go into the title. We go into the end credits, and with the exploding title to begin with, and then him "Rock and Load" at the end, and kind of point and wink at the screen. Oh, that's yeah, that's what I want from an action movie. So all is forgiven with some of the negative flaws.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is definitely a fun one. I think if you're, for people out there that haven't seen this, or I think if you have seen it and it's been a while, I think it's kind of a fun rewatch as well. It's definitely up there as one of the more fun Dolph movies, and one of the more fun action movies from this time period where there are definitely a lot of duds out there too. So this one definitely you can feel safe in watching. Right. Well, Scott, as we wrap up here, is there anything that you wanted to plug?
Well, you will have just days before this episode comes out, you will have appeared on my podcast, All 90s Action All the Time, for Batman Returns. I think I mentioned that right at the start of the episode. I think that episode is planned to come out on December the 23rd, so like something around that kind of thing, just before Christmas. It's kind of a Christmas special. And then also in January, you will be coming back to All 90s Action All the Time. We've already recorded it, but like it will come out in January when we'll be talking about Jackie Chan's City Hunter. And then, with New Horror Express, we're wrapping up our Guilty Pleasures side series that we've been doing. We're doing that for about 30 months, I guess, because we were doing that as a kind of monthly thing. That the last episode of that, which is going to be a film called Sleigh Bells, that should come out kind of just before Christmas as well. And then, going into 2023, New Horror Express, still same fortnightly. Trying to get as many interviews with different people in indie horror from around the world. I talk to people from various different countries. And just keep an eye out for All 90s Action all the time as well. Monthly episodes covering films from 1993. So come and check it out. See if any of your 1993 favorites are covered.
Yeah, no, well, I guess I have some insight into what ones are going to be covered, and I can say that there's definitely some fun ones coming for people. So definitely stay tuned for that. And also too, in your sort of your archives on All 90s Action, the Bond movies that the 90s Bond movies that you talked about, I think is another fun conversation. I think that's a period of time for Bond that I don't want to say that it's been ignored. It's sort of like it's kind of a interesting one because it's almost like a tale of two halves with that decade, where you have the Dalton ones that are kind of late 80s into the 90s, and then you got the Brosnan ones. But I think it's a fun time for Bond, and I definitely dug the podcast episodes that you did on those.
Oh well, thank you very much. There was a lot of fun to do. While it is kind of weird, because I'm very very left wing, so I generally hate the worldview of Bond films. But I'm also a lifelong Bond fan, and I've watched all the Bond films, a lot of them multiple times. So that was really a great season to do, because I'm a massive Bond nerd. And because I was born in 1985, the 90s Bonds are what I kind of grew up with, I guess. That they were amongst the first ones I saw. And so I have a lot of appreciation and nostalgia for the Brosnan era. Or those three 90s films. I have like a lot less nostalgia for Die Another Day, but that's because that's a terrible, terrible film that we'll not talk about any further. But yeah, so that was a lot of fun to do.
Yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying about that too, because it's one of those things that you grow up with this idea of like the Western centric worldview as sort of like this is how it is and this all makes sense, and then you get older and you're like, yeah, maybe not so much. And but then it's like you watch those movies and it's like, yeah, there's that idea of I don't want to use the term cancel culture, because there's that idea, I think, that like, well, anything that people see as offensive, we shouldn't be seeing it as offensive. We should just, accept it and enjoy it. And I don't think that's a good thing either. But it's kind of like that thing where you parse it, right? You say, like, okay, I get sort of what's going on here that's bad, but I also the fun stuff that's in here, it's good. And you can like, kind of like what we did with this movie, right? You can criticize the parts that don't work and appreciate the parts that do, I guess.
Yeah, I mean that's very much what I do with a lot of action movies. I must say,
Right.
there's certain movies that I enjoy as movies, but and I enjoy the actors in them, and I enjoy the colorful characters, and I enjoy the action set pieces. But like the overall kind of overarching kind of worldview, like I might not be on board with because like basically if you're a liberal you got to parse them things if you're watching a lot of action movies, particularly a lot of Americans 1980s action movies, which are just right-wing propaganda. But like, but they're very fun, and I can generally, if they stay fun, and if they don't take themselves too seriously, I can generally parse apart the parts that I like and kind of set to one side the odious right-wing propaganda.
Right, exactly. Well, it's like what happened with the 90s with action movies with the war on drugs was that like we didn't realize we were being groomed to see the police officer as this person who is like constrained by horrible red tape, but if you just let them just go out there and be a rogue, they can take down these baddies all the time. And then you realize, well, actually no, that ends up being kind of a problematic thing that like, that's there aren't any police officers that are so constrained by rules that they're letting baddies go free. It's kind of the opposite, but you have this groomed mentality of like, yeah, no, it's great. Go, smash the crackhead, the crack den, with a bolt or battering ram or whatever. And yeah, but it is like on the other hand, it's like the cop on the edge is so much fun that like,
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The
yeah,
the Maverick Army cop is
yeah,
a great to watch on film,
right.
but obviously the real world equivalent of that, terrible.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, and I think that was the thing at the time. I didn't realize I was being groomed to want that version to be in real life. And then one of the first things was I had a friend who was a defense attorney who was telling me like, yeah, it kind of doesn't work like Law and Order, like like procedurals that you see on TV, where like the judge is like, oh, you found that coke in that person's dashboard without a search warrant. Oh, we're just throwing that out. He's like, no, that doesn't really work that way. It's if you've got the coke in your dashboard and the cop finds it, you're going to jail, even if it wasn't there wasn't a search warrant to look through the car. And once I started to kind of figure that kind of stuff out. I was like, okay, the cop on the edge is it's its own thing, and I appreciate that. The grizzled guy with his jean jacket or his leather coat and his 5 o'clock shadow, smoking cigarettes and beating up guys all the time. It's fun in an action movie, but in real life, you got to kind of see it as like, okay, I'm not going to allow that to affect my voting patterns and things like that in the United States.
Oh, for sure not. Like,
Yeah.
it's like with the Bond thing. Like, I love the Bond films, and I love the actors who play Bond. Bond is a terrible character. He's an alcoholic sociopath. And like Bond, if you took Bond on like a serious level, like Bond is basically everything that is wrong with like a conservative British mentality. Like he's misogynistic. He has like an imperialistic worldview that like wants to go back to when Britannia ruled the waves. Like it's just, like it's terrible character. But like if you just take him on like purely movie terms as like just like this kind of uh, you know you know punches first, ask questions later, kind of fun, kind of one-liner quipping kind of guy. Like it's fun to watch. So like, and some people can't park those things, and some people can't like take the park the misogyny and the racism and like that imperialistic worldview to one side, and that's fine. I understand if you can't separate that. That's fine, and I can understand if people hate the Bond movies on those terms. But for me, like I watch them and I enjoy the one-liners, I enjoy the colorful villains, I enjoy the kind of exaggerated kind of superhuman henchmen. Like I enjoy the gadgets, the exotic locations, the cars, all these things. And yes, I hate the worldview, and I hate all the conservative nonsense around the Bond films. But I can generally, while I'm watching them, kind of push that over to one side.
Yeah,
But
and
that's
I
just me.
I'm kind of the same way. I think originally I think that's what I think we're going to be learning that more as we kind of go on in in years where we're like, okay, how do we separate or parse out the parts that, and kind of criticize the movie for the parts that are bad, but then appreciate the parts that are fun. And I think, yeah, we're sort of learning those parts. But I think, like you said, with those '90s Bond films, there is almost like a longing for a past that wasn't necessarily good. At the same time, there's a kind of a present in those movies with Pierce Brosnan that was a lot of fun. And I think, yeah, like you said, you kind of can put the longing for the past that wasn't good to the side and appreciate that present that was just so much fun with him.
Yeah, and Pierce Brosnan's just a fun actor to watch, and just also like when revisiting the '90s Bond films, just a ridiculously beautiful man. Like I just this really struck me. I was like rewatching like GoldenEye, and I was like, God damn, Pierce Brosnan was handsome.
Exactly. Well, it's funny 'cause when I was watching Livewire for the podcast episode that's going to kind of be out a couple before this that I did with the Exploding Helicopter, with Will from Exploding Helicopter, we were talking about the love scene that he has with the woman's name was Lila Orbach in that movie. And I was saying how, like, in a lot of these movies, like we're talking about here in this Command Performance movie, how it's like, here's Dolph, this older guy with all these women fawning over him and all of that stuff. But here with Live Wire, you're like, no, Lisa, I said Lila, it's Lisa Eilbacher. It's almost like she's sort of the one who's moving up in the love scene, right? That like she's fortunate enough that she can do a love scene with Pierce Brosnan. It had like a different feel to it when it's that kind of thing, as opposed to like, the main character getting the really beautiful woman that he really probably couldn't get in any other circumstance. She's kind of the one who's in that circumstance here.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well. Thanks again, Scott, for coming on. It was a lot of fun. We'll definitely have to look at some other ones here, but I think Dolph is one. It's interesting. A lot of times, people when they come on for the first time, they do a Dolph movie. It just seems to be like it's the sort of the wheelhouse or the easier one to just kind of bang out a Dolph movie and get that one in there. But I'm definitely be happy to have you on again. We can talk about whether it's horror or more action movies. And for people out there listening, definitely check out all '90s action and definitely sorry, New Horror Express. Check those movies out. Or sorry, check those podcasts out. I'm sorry, I'm starting to get towards the end here. I'm losing my train of thought a little bit. But check out New Horror Express and all '90s action all the time. And thank you again, Scott, for coming on.
It's good to be on, and I'll be more than happy to come on again. Yeah.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks everybody for listening, and we'll talk soon. Bye, everyone.